Welcome back everyone, it's Eric from Rare Candy, and today I'm going over my full thoughts on the next Sword and Shield expansion, Vivid Voltage, in this set review. Like usual, Vivid Voltage is a combination of a variety of existing different Japanese cards, this time pulling from their legendary Heartbeat and Shocking Volt Tackle sets, with a couple of Japanese promo cards also thrown in the mix. And all of this totals up to 180 plus new cards with plenty of new Pokemon V and V-max, but the big new thing Vivid Voltage is introducing is a new type of Pokemon in the form of amazing rares. While they do share the same name as their other single prize counterparts, these cards stand out because of their strong attacks. But before we dive into this set review, be sure to smack that like button, as it genuinely does help get our videos seen by more Pokemon TCG fans on YouTube. And like always with our set reviews, since these sets are so massive, I've pinned timestamps to the top of the comments section so that you can easily jump to any card in this set review. But with that being said, sit back, get comfortable, and let's see what Vivid Voltage has in store for us. So to kick things off, we're going to be looking at a new Beedrill. Beedrill, of course, is a Stage 2 Pokemon, 130 HP, Fire Weakness, and it does have free retreat, which is also pretty nice. But it has this ability, once during your turn, if this card is the only card in your hand, you may play it onto your bench, then draw 3 cards. And its only attack for a grass and colorless does just a generic 120. So needless to say, let's get this right out of the way. We are not going to be attacking with Beedrill. Now, if this card was like 120 for 1, I think there'd be more of a consideration, but even then, I'm still not convinced this would be a good attacker. So really, I think the discussion for this card is going to be based around this ability. And this is actually a very similar ability to the Greninja GX from the Detective Pikachu set. And Greninja GX, while it did see actually a good bit of play, I really didn't see play because of its ability. You know, every now and again, you would sometimes find yourself in a situation where you could throw it down. But generally speaking, Mewtwo and Mew decks, which were the main decks to play Greninja, really weren't built in a way to really attempt to abuse that ability. So if we're actually building around this, I actually do kind of think there's enough ways to abuse this ability. I think one of the big reasons why this some semblance of hope is because we have both Galarian Meowth and the Duskull right now in the format that have these abilities that allow you to discard cards from your hand and search your deck for their evolutions. Now, of course, you don't need to play their evolutions. You can use the abilities either way. But right now in the standard format, that's going to be one of our best ways at playing down our hand. And in conjunction with cards like Rose Tower that allow you to draw cards while having a low hand size, I mean, I do think we actually have sort of a way at building an engine that allows you to kind of turbo through your deck while operating at a low hand size without having to rely on supporter cards, which is actually really powerful. Non-supporter based draw in particular has always been one of the strongest effects we've seen in the game, whether it's something like Acrobike or Judge Whistle, or even like older cards like Shaman EX, you know, the more recent Crobat V, etc., etc. So, I mean, that has me really interested. Now, the question is, what deck wants to play Beedrill? And to be honest, I'm totally not sure, guys. I mean, this is a card I was really teetering on giving sort of a negative rating just because I'm really not convinced of an immediate home that Beedrill really fits into, but this does sort of open the possibility of a turbo style engine, like I mentioned, in conjunction with Rose Tower and a Galarian Meowth or Duskull. I do think you can actually successfully turbo through your deck with some of these cards, and not to mention we can also abuse Scoop Up Net on this thing, which is really dope. So I do have to say, while I'm going to be honest, I don't think in the short term I see a great home for Beedrill. I do think this card has potential just due to some of the other cards surrounding it that enable this sort of turbo engine while operating off a low hand size. So for that reason, I'm going to remain neutral on Beedrill. It's probably worth picking up a couple copies of this card just to have on hand, but definitely not one of the heavyweights from this set by any means. Next up, we have the first of the different amazing rare cards throughout Vivid Voltage, and that's going to be Celebi. Celebi here is a basic Pokemon, of course, 60 HP, Fire Weakness, 1 retreat cost, and its first attack here for a Grass Energy does 30 times the amount of energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon, and its second attack for a Lightning and Psychic Energy. Search your deck for a card that evolves from each of your bench Pokemon, and play those cards on top of your Pokemon to evolve them, then shuffle your deck. So as you guys can see, Celebi definitely has some very awkward attack costs, that's for sure. Energy Press here I don't think is a particularly strong attack. You know, it's not like the worst thing in the world for a single energy, but really if we're going to carve out deck space for a card like this, it's going to be for this second attack. You know, despite its really awkward attack cost, the effect here is actually pretty good, to be honest. Being able to evolve theoretically 5 Pokemon into stage 1s is an effect that I do actually like about this. But again, guys, you can tell the issue we are running into here is the attack cost. Now, the one good thing Celebi does have going for it is the fact that one of these energies is a lightning, which means we can theoretically power this up on turn 1. And really, that's the only turn you want to use an attack like this. You really don't want to use an attack like this on turn 2 or 3. You want to be attacking by this point. So we can actually use this turn 1, which means Celebi does have like a shred, I mean a shred of hope. But the other big downside to Celebi is that even after I look through basically the entire card pool in standard format, I think the best partner is probably going to be Arctozolt, which really doesn't bode too well for Celebi, I think. So, I mean, I don't think the Galarian Cursula Arctozolt deck is anything particularly special, but I will say that Celebi is actually pretty cool in that deck just because you're already going to be playing Psychic Energy and probably Lightning as well to cheat that second attachment you would usually want on your Galarian Cursulas. So I think that is something sort of to highlight there, which I do like about Celebi. But again, guys, I mean, we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel if we're talking about Galarian Cursula V and Arctozolt here. So I'm really not a big fan of this. You know, evolutions just in general aren't too great right now in conjunction with this wacky attack cost. Gonna have to pass on Celebi for the moment overall. Next up, we have a new Shiftry card. Shiftry is going to be a Stage 2 Pokemon, 150 HP, Fire Weakness, and an unfortunate 3 retreat cost for this card. But it has this ability: as long as this Pokemon is your active, the effect of each supporter card in your opponent's hand becomes draw 3 cards from your deck. And its only attack here for a grass and colorless energy does 110, and you may have your opponent switch their active with one of their bench Pokemon. So clearly the ability is really the star of this Shiftry card. And this ability, don't get it confused, is actually quite good because this basically turns all of your opponent's supporter cards into Hop, which is definitely a really good effect, I do have to say. You know, Welders no longer going to allow your opponent to accelerate energy. Your opponent can no longer use Boss's Orders to bring up, you know, a Dedenne GX or a Crobat on your bench. They can no longer use something like Mallow and Lana to heal off their Pokemon. So yeah, this ability is actually sick. I actually really love this ability on Shiftry. But that's about where my enthusiasm ends. This attack, while not horrible, I mean, we can get it powered up in one turn thanks to something like Coco Prism, or God forbid, even a Rillaboom, if we are unfortunate enough to run a second Stage 2 alongside this. So we can get this powered up. A 110 is just a really bad number to hit. We can't even two-shot Zacian V with this thing thanks to its resistance. Realistically, I think we need to hit for something closer to 140 because that way we could two-shot tag teams and two-shot Zacian V. But 110 is just such a bad number to hit for on a Stage 2. So then at that point, it's like, well, we can't really attack with Shiftry, so maybe this could be a good wall, because this actually is a really good walling ability. You know, think of something like Greedent or Behemoth, just as an example, being able to throw up a Shiftry in between attacks to make sure they can't snipe stuff on your bench with Boss's Orders. Does actually seem really attractive, but like I mentioned at the beginning of this card's introduction, it does have that very unfortunate 3 retreat cost, so something like Air Balloon isn't even going to allow Shiftry to freely move out of the active spot. So at that point, guys, I'm just like, well, what are we doing with this card at this point? The ability is so good. Like, this ability is probably one of the best abilities in the set, I would even say. But just all the other things surrounding Shiftry just really make it hard to get excited. Stage 2, it needs 2 manual attachments most of the time to get attacking, and the attack itself is pretty underpowered. Can't retreat easily, so unfortunately, the rest of the card just isn't really designed in a way that sets this card up for success. And as a result, I'm going to have to downvote it. But maybe in the future, I could see a world where this card maybe does see some degree of play just because of how strong this ability is. But right now, the circumstances just aren't in its favor. Next up, we have a combo of cards we're going to be looking at. That's going to be a new Ninjask and Shedinja. So as usual with these cards, they do have some synergy with one another. So let's take a look at Ninjask first. It's a Stage 1, and it says once during your turn, whenever you play this card from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon, you may search your deck for a Shedinja and put it on your bench, then shuffle your deck. And its only attack for grass energy is 30 and heal 30 from this Pokemon. So it's pretty much clear from the get-go here we are not playing Ninjask to be able to attack. So this card is basically only as good as the quality of Shedinja that we have. So taking a look at Shedinja here, it is actually important to point out this card is a basic Pokemon. It cannot actually evolve from Nincada, and it has this ability. This card can only be put into play with Ninjask's Shell Out ability, and you can't even put the card into play when setting up a match. and its only attack for 3 colorless energy. Put damage counters on your opponent's active until its remaining HP is 10. So this card's design is actually pretty annoying. The fact that it's being classified as a basic is really bad because we can't use triple acceleration energy with it. So now if we actually want to attack with this, we have to run both twin energy and some copies of something like Tapu Koko Prism Star, or even Turbo Patch, since Turbo Patch will technically work with Shedinja since the card is being classified as a basic in this case. But really guys, I think they're asking a lot to get this thing up and running. Now Shedinja's attack is like kind of okay if we can get it up and running, because we do have things like Garbodor to inflict poison to knock our opponent out in between turns. But I mean, you can start to see we're having to play a lot of cards just to get this entire strategy up and running. We need a stage 1 line in the form of Ninjask. We need a stage 1 line in the form of Garbodor. More than likely, we need some copies of Shedinja. We need scoop up nets to reuse Ninjask throughout the course of a game, etc, etc. So my knee-jerk reaction is that Shedinja just costs way too much to get up and running. Just way too many combo pieces need to sort of fall into place quickly for this deck to be kind of functional. So for that reason, guys, I'm going to downvote this. I'm not a big fan of the Shedinja right now, but I will say we might need to keep an eye on Ninjask for the future. As more and more Shedinja cards get printed, Ninjask could gradually become better if we get some better Shedinjas to go with it. So for the moment, guys, I'm not a big fan of this combo of cards. We might end up covering it on the channel just for fun, but from a competitive angle, I'm just not quite convinced right now that this combo has what it takes to be competitive. Next up, guys, we have our first VMAX of the set review, and that is going to be Orbeetle VMAX. So before we take a look at the VMAX, we do need to look at the base form Orbeetle. Its first attack for a grass energy does 20. You may switch this Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. Its second attack for a grass colorist does 50 plus 30 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. And then the VMAX has this ability: once during your turn before you attack, this Pokemon is your active. You may put 1 damage counter on each of your opponent's Pokemon. And its only attack here for Grass Colorist does 50 plus 50 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active. So I have to say, guys, I'm actually a really big fan of this card. It reminds me of some of my favorite cards throughout the years. Like the Chandelure all the way back from Noble Victories, or Decidueye GX back from Sun and Moon. I've just always been a super big fan of these sorts of abilities that allow you to cheat extra damage counters into play, and Orbeetle VMAX is definitely no exception to that. So when discussing how to play Orbeetle, I actually do think you can just go in and build your own designated Orbeetle VMAX deck. I think that will probably work just fine. But also you could potentially play Orbeetle as a potential math fixer in certain decks as well, especially if they aren't playing something like a Galarian Zigzagoon, like Scoop Up Net Engine or something like that. Orbeetle might be a nice way to always give yourself a good Pokemon to promote in between knockouts and cheat some extra damage counters into play. So that seems kind of nice. But right now I'm thinking of Orbeetle more as its own designated deck, just because I think this card is really going to be at its best when you have 3 to 4 of these in play and you're switching multiple times in a single turn to cheat extra damage counters. And in that regard, I think this card has a ton of support, because if we just run through some of the different options that we have for switching, of course we have Switch. We also have Scoop Up Net, and Scoop Up Net, of course, I think does pair really nicely, just because I would imagine you're probably playing a Jirachi engine with this. Also maybe playing Galarian Zigzagoon to double down on your damage counter placing strategy that you have. We also have Bird Keeper as a supporter card as well, and we have U-Turn Board. U-Turn Board in particular is really cool on Orbeetle, since it does have a 1 retreat cost and is always going to give us free retreat. So I think we actually have a lot of ways to make our board very mobile and be able to abuse these abilities multiple times every turn. And its attack really isn't horrible either, because if we are playing against a Pokemon that attacks for 3 energy, which is typically sort of the average that we're going to be looking at, we're going to be hitting for 200. Yes, I do know that is going to mean we are a little bit short of knocking out a Zacian V, but of course, between all of our different damage spreading shenanigans, we probably can get there, I actually do think. Now, one thing we do have to keep in mind with Orbeetle VMAX is that pesky fire weakness. Fire is going to be a good type basically as long as Wailord and Zacian V both exist in a format. So we will have to be mindful of those Centiskorch VMAX decks, those Blacephalon decks, etc. And luckily we do still have weakness card energy in format to kind of help with that a little bit. And even though this card does have a 2 attack cost, I really don't think it's going to be a big deal most of the time. You know, we've seen Dragapult VMAX in the past survive just fine with a 2 attack cost. Same thing for Eternatus as well. So I have to say, guys, I'm actually a pretty big fan of this card. It doesn't have like that insane raw damage output of something like Eternatus VMAX that we got in the last set, but being able to choose where your damage counters go is such a strong effect. That's kind of what made Dragapult VMAX so good back during the Rebel Clash format. And of course, with cards like the Decidueye GX and Chandelure and their respective formats, those cards were really good because they allow you to put damage counters basically exactly where you want them, and allow you to sometimes cheat extra KOs on turns that you might not have otherwise been able to get. So I have to say, guys, big thumbs up for me on Orbeetle. This is going to be certainly one of the cards I'm most excited about testing. Looks like a lot of fun and looks like a pretty strong card. So big thumbs up. Next up, we're going to be looking at Zarude V. This is going to be Zarude's first representation in the TCG. And it's a basic Pokemon V with 210 HP, Fire Weakness, and a 1 Retreat. And it has 2 different attacks, the first of which, for 2 colors, does 50, and your opponent's active can't retreat during your opponent's next turn. And then, more interestingly, its second attack for 2 Grass Energy does 100, and you may attach up to 2 basic energy cards from your hand to your bench Pokemon in any way that you like, then heal all damage from those Pokemon. You actually might even recognize this second attack. It's almost the exact same as the attack that we saw on Mega Sceptile EX all the way back from Ancient Origins. Mega Sceptile really didn't have like breakout success like you would think, despite having a pretty cool attack like this. That's one of the first things kind of going against Zarude. The precedent for this attack being good isn't really quite there. Mega Sceptile was decent, but definitely not tier 1 ever at any point. But I will say, being able to heal all damage in a format with Pokemon that have over 300 HP is something not to be slept on. There are a couple of pretty sturdy grass Pokemon in the format. Of course, we just looked at the Orbeetle VMAX, definitely not one of the tankier ones out there, but still has over 300 HP, so we're going to count it. We do have things like Rillaboom VMAX and also Butterfree VMAX, but we're going to pretend like Butterfree doesn't really exist here. I think Orbeetle and Rillaboom VMAX are going to be some of the bigger contenders for a card like this. And I think if we're looking at specifically Rillaboom VMAX, I do think there might be an argument for playing Zarude in a deck like that, just because Rillaboom already doesn't really take any one-shots on things that aren't tag teams, and has to discard its own energy whenever it does want to do more damage. So let's say you're attacking with Rillaboom, and let's say you're going against, Eternatus, just as an easy example. You swing on them, discard your energy. They're going to swing into you. They're not going to knock you out, though, just because you have 330 HP. And then from there, you pivot into a Zarude, finish them off with this attack while also healing off all of the damage on your Rillaboom VMAX. So I have to say, I think Zarude actually seems like a really solid partner for a deck like that. But the issue is, of course, the Rillaboom and Rillaboom VMAX decks really just haven't been that great in recent memory. You know, they're not horrible decks by any means, but they're certainly not on the same power level as something like your Zacian V decks or your Eternatus decks. But Zarude definitely, I think, can look to give those decks a little bit of a boost. And while I do think that is probably the more likely of homes for a card like this, we do need to point out the text says attached to basic energy, not to grass energy. So what that means is you can actually use Zarude as a form of energy acceleration for other types as well. You know, more than likely you will need some sort of Turbo Patch engine to be able to get this guy powered up a little bit more quickly. But nevertheless, we can still power up some of those types, like Fighting as an example, which historically usually has kind of awkward energy acceleration, or even Psychic right now, which doesn't have many great options either. And you can use Zarude to get those other types up and running. So that's another thing we will have to keep our eye out on for this card in the future. So while I do like this attack, I think the issues with this, like I already sort of mentioned, are I don't think Rillaboom is that strong right now. And outside of that, I don't see too many really compelling homes for this card. But like I said, guys, being able to both accelerate energy and heal all damage from Pokemon in a format with HPs over 300 is a really strong effect. So this is a card I will stay a little bit neutral on, but I definitely would say pick up at least a copy of this card after Vivid Voltage drops. This is definitely, I think, going to be a solid card to have on hand for when the right moment comes for it. So while it's not obvious if the perfect home exists immediately for this card, it's hard to imagine it not seeing some play at some point during its lifespan. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at a new Charizard. Charizard is a Stage 2, of course, with a whopping 170 HP, so definitely one of the tankier Charizards we've had up till this point. But Water Weakness, 3 retreat cost, nothing too special there. But it has this ability, once during your turn, you may look at the top 3 cards of your deck, put one into your hand and discard the other cards. And then its only attack here for 2 fire energy does 100 plus 50 more for each Leon in your discard pile. So this is definitely a stage 2 that catches my attention. I think both the ability and the attack are actually pretty decent. So the ability itself I think is really cool because the big issue that stage 2 Pokemon have, of course, is that every turn they basically need to find themselves another rare candy and another stage 2 and make sure that Pokemon is powered up. So that's a big disadvantage that stage 2s have compared to a lot of the basic attackers that are running around in the game. And this ability is really going to help you keep digging through your deck every turn to make sure that you can find that next attacker for your next turn. So really like this ability. It is unfortunate you do have to discard the cards, but hopefully most of the time the pros are going to outweigh the cons. And the attack is also kind of decent because if we just run through the math, if we have all 4 Leon in the discard pile, this card is going to be hitting for 300 damage, which is definitely nothing to scoff at. That can knock out all of the tag team Pokemon and of course all of the base form Pokemon V that are running around in the format right now. You know, even in the case of Zacian, we don't even need all 4 Leon in the discard pile to take a knockout there. We only need 1, which is actually really nice. But if you guys aren't too familiar with Leon, Leon's actually kind of a cool card in and of itself as well, just because it's a supporter card and your attacks do 30 more for the turn. So if you have 3 Leon already in the discard pile and your supporter for turn is going to be a Leon, then we can cap out at 330, which is definitely really good. The only thing we're going to be short of knocking out is going to be Eternatus V-max, but we can play a Galarian Zigzagoon if we are dead set on hitting that magic sort of 340 number. So Charizard has a good little consistency boosting engine built right into it. Has an attack that can hit for some pretty good damage, but as you guys can see by the graphic on screen, I have not committed to saying that this card is good. And I mean, that's partially just due to the normal reasons of being stage 2, but also because we have to play Welder with this. And while at a glance, you guys might think, what do you mean? Why is that a bad thing to have to play Welder with a fire Pokemon? I think specifically when it comes to evolutions in stage 2 Pokemon, I really don't like Welder because unlike some of the 2 and 3 prize Pokemon that are running around, you can safely Welder to that Pokemon and then not get knocked out on the following turn. But if we have to Welder to like a Charmander, just as an example, something like that can be picked off by so many things in the format, basically making you waste a supporter for turn, which is definitely going to be a little bit of a pain. And also, we can't play Welder and Leon in the same turn unless we have something like a Surge strategy. So I think there's some natural awkwardness just built into the engine of Charizard, and being a stage 2 is just only going to sort of compound those issues. So this is a card, no doubt, I will be experimenting with to see how it does, but without having any testing in at the time of recording this segment, I'm not quite convinced that this engine is going to be consistent enough and smooth enough to be successful every game that you're going to be playing. So for the moment, I'm going to remain neutral on Charizard, but I do think this is a pretty cool card. I do think it has a lot going for it, and it is one to keep an eye out for. Next up, we have all 3 of the Kanto Eeveelutions that we're going to be looking at here. We're going to be talking about all of them together just because they all have a very similar ability. So in the case of Flareon, it says if this Pokemon has Memory Capsule attached to it, each player's Grass Pokemon in play has no abilities. For Vaporeon, if it has Memory Capsule attached, each player's Fire Pokemon has no abilities. And for Jolteon, each player's Water Pokemon has no abilities. So at a glance, I think it's actually kind of cool. It's very similar to the old Garbotox and Garbodors we've had throughout the years. Now, of course, this is going to be a little bit more specific. You need a very specific tool as opposed to Garbodor, and it only shuts off abilities for certain Pokemon. But I have to say, guys, I'm not really sold on these cards. These cards are not splashable in the same way that Garbodor was because, you know, most decks in the format that Garbodor was already in were already playing cards like Floatstone, so playing Garbodor in your deck doesn't really require you to run weird tool cards, just the ones that you're basically already going to be playing. And of course with Garbodor, not only does it prevent all abilities, but it also stops all abilities in hand and discard. These evolutions are only specifying Pokemon in play, so what that means is, in the case of something like Flareon, your opponent can still play Eldegoss V if I understand this card's wording correctly. Now again, we'll have to see how these cards are going to be worded whenever they get translated officially into English. But right now, as I understand it, something like an Eldegoss V is not actually going to be stopped by this ability, which definitely makes these cards a little bit worse, but still there are abilities that are worth shutting off in the format. In the case of water Pokemon, we have Frostmoth. In the case of grass Pokemon, we do have Decidueye. There's not too many fire Pokemon really worth shutting off abilities on right now. I think maybe Heatran GX is probably the best one if I just had to guess. But if you're committing to playing probably a 2-2 of one of these evolutions and 2 to 3 of these memory capsules, man, that's a lot of deck space to shut down these very specific cards when you could probably play harder counters to those cards with the same amount of deck space or even less. So I have to say, guys, I'm just not a big fan of any of these evolutions. Maybe if we had an Eevee that had a very strong attack, maybe we could argue playing Memory Capsule to be able to attack with Eevee could be good. But right now, I'm just really not seeing it. While Ability Lock in the past has been very, very strong, how specific and cumbersome this form of Ability Lock is leads me to believe that these cards probably won't be that good. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at Talonflame V. Talonflame V is a basic Pokemon, 190 HP, and does have some other interesting stats going on at the bottom of the card. It does have a Lightning Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and a free retreat cost. So Lightning Weakness in particular is really cool. That gives us a little bit of type coverage if we're a fire deck to maybe better go against water attackers. And needless to say, something like Free Retreat is always going to be welcome on a card. But it has two different attacks here, the first of which says for a colorless energy, if you go first, you can use this attack on the first turn, discard your hand, and draw 6 cards. And second attack for 2 fire and a colorless does 160, discard an energy from this Pokemon. So I definitely think the first attack is where Talonflame is probably the most interesting. Its second attack is fine, to be honest. It actually has a pretty solid 2-shotting attack. You're going to be able to one-shot stuff like Zacian and also 2-shot opposing V-maxes, which is cool. But Fire already has some pretty good attackers already. So if we're playing this, like I said, that first attack is going to be the main one we're going to focus on. So this is a really cool attack. We don't have too many like this in the current format, but being able to use an attack on your first turn is really good. One of the big downsides to Wailord decks right now is the fact that they are very reliant on going second. And if you are unfortunate enough to go first, you can't use that fully powered Flare Starter on your Volcanions, you can't Welder, and sometimes you can just be left with an awkward first turn. So Talonflame now gives you a pretty solid option in that type of regard here. And the fact that it's colorless energy means that other decks can abuse this that aren't fire decks, which makes Talonflame kind of diverse in that regard, kind of in the same way that a Zacian V has seen play in non-metal decks just for that Intrepid Sword ability. Same sort of case here for Talonflame V. But I think overall, when I'm thinking about decks that I want to play Talonflame in, I think it's probably going to be decks that are fire decks or decks that actively want to see cards hit the discard pile. And the reason for that is if we're playing a non-fire deck that doesn't care about stuff being in the discard, I mean, this is effectively no different than using Dene Change on your first turn. And in the case of the Dene, you don't have to actually commit energy to it to use its ability either, making it probably a little bit better, despite it being, 160 HP GX that's sitting on your bench. But I will say that it's really cool that you can now use Dene Change to discard your hand, draw 6, use Crobat V to draw your hand back up to 6, and still end your turn with this attack to discard your hand and draw 6 again. So at Talonflame, you can actually have a pretty explosive first turn, which definitely counts for something. I also really do like the fact that Talonflame doesn't have an ability just because you can now play this in Greens decks. And Greens decks in particular are some of the decks that get hurt the most by being forced to go first. Especially if we look back, a lot of the Greens decks traditionally have been Welder based. So both of your supporters are absolutely worthless on turn 1. And if you play Talonflame, you now do have a decent option turn 1 if you do need to draw some cards to make sure you don't get benched out or something like that. So overall, guys, I do actually think I like this Talonflame. I think it makes sense in fire decks out there just because you have this solid first attack. Its second attack does hit for some pretty good numbers against some different things in the format as well. And the fact that its first attack is colorless energy means that it is potentially a splashable card in a number of different decks. So overall, guys, I do like Talonflame. I think this is a solid card that we're getting here. Now, do I think this is going to become a new one-of in every deck, like in the way that Crobat and Dedenne are? No, I do not, just because this is an attack. You do have to commit energy to Talonflame, but it's flexible enough to where I would be surprised if this card did not see play. So for that reason, guys, I am going to stand beside Talonflame V. Next up, guys, we're going to be looking at a new Wailord card. Wailord is going to be a stage 1 with his signature massive HP of 200, and then it has a lightning weakness and a 4 retreat cost. Its ability says whenever you attach a water energy from hand to this Pokemon, heal all special conditions. And then its only attack for 4 colorless energy does 10 plus 40 more for each water energy attached to this Pokemon. So Wailord's actually kind of an interesting card, and one that I was honestly a little bit torn on in terms of my rating. This is one of those cards that my knee-jerk reaction was like, oh, just straight up bad. We're never going to play this. But I think there is a slight case to be made for Wailord that could maybe see my rating change over time. Maybe once after I get some hands-on time with this card. But first, let's talk about the good about Wailord. 200 HP on a stage 1. That's great. For retreat cost, also good because we can use buff padding to get 250 HP. That seems okay. We're going to be out of one-shot range of Zacian unless they've used Altered Creation, so that seems kind of cool. And we have effectively an unlimited damage cap thanks to Frostmoth. And unlike something like Lapras V-max, we're only going to give up 1 prize if we do decide to go all in on Wailord and take like a big one-hit knockout. So playing like a 1 prize Frostmoth deck, especially now that we're getting Nessa in the same set as well, that can one-shot anything, seems kind of good. Like, that's honestly something I will probably experiment with, but Wailord I definitely think has some downsides. The ability is like almost worthless on this card. I mean, it's better than having nothing in addition to this attack, but it's pretty irrelevant here. But the damage modifier that Hydro Pump here has, I think is just slightly too weak. So let's just run through the math across the board to see what we need to take one-shots on some of the different multi-prize Pokemon. We're going to need a whopping 6 energy to knock out a Zacian V. The attack literally just makes us 10 damage shy of knocking it out with 1 less energy, so that feels kind of bad. We're going to need 7 energy to knock out tag teams that hover around the 270 to 280 HP range, and then we're going to need between 8 and 9 energy to knock out the different VMAXs that are floating around. So, I mean, let's not get it confused. We can definitely pull that off with Frostmoth, but one of the big downsides to Wailord, as opposed to something like Lapras VMAX, is even though it is only giving up 1 prize, more than likely it is going to be return KO'd, unlike something like Lapras. So you're going to have to commit a ton of energy to this thing to take one of these big one-hit knockouts, and then you're just going to lose all that energy, and you have to find all of that energy again on the next turn with cards like Nessa, Energy Retrieval, etc. So I think Wailord forces you to have an immense amount of resources every turn that you want to get a one-hit knockout with this card. Now, to be fair, you don't have to take one-hit knockouts with Wailord. You could just play the 2-shot game with a lower amount of energy, but at that point it's like, well, why are we even playing Wailord when there are other cards that can 2-shot your opponent? So those are really the 2 big things that are deterring me from Wailord. The damage modifier that it has, which because of that forces you to need so many resources every time you want to take a one-hit knockout with this thing. So Wailord, I will actually say, I think warrants some testing, to be fair. But right now, I'm not convinced of this card. I think it has too many things working against it. So for the moment, it's going to be a thumbs down for me. Next up, we're going to be looking at Galarian Darmanitan V-max. And as usual, before we look at the V-max, let's take a look at the base form Darmanitan. So for Watercolorist, does 50 and also does 30 to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And its other attack for 2 Water and a Colorist is 190 and 30 to itself. And then the Galarian Darmanitan V-max just has 1 singular attack here for 4 water energy is 200, and this also does 30 damage to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So yet again, we're getting another water VMAX partner for Frostmoth. Up until this point, there's definitely been mixed results for all of these different water VMAXs. So the question is Galarian Darmanitan going to change things in that regard? And I have to say it's a pretty resounding no for a few reasons. And one of the biggest reasons is going to be that pesky metal weakness that you see down in the bottom left-hand corner of this card, which means Zacian can easily just nuke this thing. And Galarian Darmanitan can't even one-shot it back either. It is going to cap out at 200 damage. I mean, unless the format gets completely turned on its head and Zacian becomes magically worse overnight, I don't think you can just take that sort of loss here. And what also is unfortunate about the card is the fact that it doesn't have colorless energy in its attack cost, which means we can't even play weakness card energy. And as already mentioned, like I said, we only hit for 200, which means we can't even take a return KO. So that's, I think, just one of the biggest things that sort of makes this card bad. But I will point out there are actually some decent tool cards that do pair nicely with this evolution line. The first of which is going to be Struggle Gloves, just because Struggle Gloves allows a Pokemon to hit for 30 extra damage against a Pokemon it has the weakness of. So suddenly, Galarian Darmanitan V-max and even the base form Galarian Darmanitan V can one-shot Zacian, which is going to be good, though I'd argue you're still probably going to lose that matchup overall no matter what. But I think more importantly, against the non-Zacian matchups, we also are getting the new Telephotoscope card in the set, which is going to be a tool card that allows your Pokemon to hit for 30 more bench damage against Pokemon V and GX. So that actually makes things a little bit interesting because both the pre-evolution and the VMAX here both have attacks that can hit for decent bench damage, and being able to amplify that by 30 is nothing to scoff at here, because let's say we are for some reason building a Galarian Darmanitan VMAX deck. If our opponent has Dedennes or Crobats on the bench, all we have to do is spread 3 times. With this tool card attached, we can knock out a Dedenne GX and a Crobat V. So if your opponent does overbench some of these 2 prize support Pokemon that are so popular, you might be able to get away with just knocking out one main attacker and the bench damage coming in and cleaning up those knockouts on some of those bench sitters. So I think that is one of the main things that kind of builds a case for this card. But again, guys, Zacian is just so dominant and widespread that it's going to pretty much shut out the chances of a card like this seeing success. Now, maybe over time, if we do start to get some cards that deter people from playing Zacian V, Galarian Darmanitan might genuinely have a shot to be decent just because it can pick off multiple KOs, much like its other VMAX Frostmoth partner Inteleon VMAX. But I think if we are going the sniping route with Frostmoth, Inteleon right now is the better option just because it is not weak to Zacian and also has a solid single energy attack it can fall back on as well. So for the moment, Galarian Darmanitan, even though it does have some different forms of energy acceleration and ways to compound its spread strategy, I just don't think it's being released into the right metagame for this card to have a chance of even remotely being good. Next up, guys, we're looking at a new single prize Pokemon, and that is going to be Cramorant. Cramorant is a basic Pokemon with 110 HP, lightning weakness, fighting resistance, and a single retreat cost. And it just has one singular attack here. And it says you may discard any number of Arrokuda from your bench, and this attack does 60 for each Arrokuda discarded in this way. So that's actually kind of cool. You know, if we just run through the math really quickly, if we discard all 4 Arrokuda, hitting 240, that knocks out Zacian V. We're in business. So we can knock out 1 prizers, we can knock out the 2 prizers, and we can 2-shot the different 3 prizers in the game. So yeah, that's a big thumbs up for me. That's basically what I think Pokemon cards need to do right now in the current format to have any shot at being good, and Cramorant is going to check that box. And of course, it's no coincidence that we are getting a card like Nessa in the same set, which will allow us to retrieve up to 4 Pokemon out of the discard pile. So of course, after we do attack with Cramorant, we can use Nessa, get all of those Arrokudas back into our hand, and get them back down on the bench. Having colorless energy and its attack cost also does make this card kind of flexible. Of course, we can play Twin Energy to easily get this thing up and running. We can play Tapu Koko Prism Star if we want to cheat lightning energies into play. We can also play things like Turbo Patch and Psychic Energy specifically, because Psychic Energy will allow us to play Latios GX to shut off Altered Creation, which is really the big Achilles heel to a card like this, is that it's just going to get wrecked by any ADP variant that is going to be floating around out there. And ADP has shown no signs of going anywhere. Up until this point, I've been pretty optimistic overall, but like I just mentioned, ADP is going to be one of the biggest challenges of a card like this. And it remains to be seen if we can successfully build in a way that will allow us to fix that sort of otherwise rough matchup that we're going to have. Also, too, the other big thing is we have to find 4 Arrokudas every turn, which is definitely going to be a bit of a pain here. We can only play 4 Nessa in a deck, but if we're playing Nessa on a given turn, that means we're not playing a Professor's Research, we're not playing Marnie, etc. And there's going to be turns where we need to find ourselves a Cramorant and an Energy, and Nessa is just not going to allow us to do all of that. And that's where I do get a little bit pessimistic about this card, or at the very least, my enthusiasm does get curbed ever so slightly. Just because we don't have a very efficient way at retrieving Arrokudas outside of Nessa means that we are going to be very reliant on a supporter card that just doesn't really make us see a lot of cards every turn. Actually, really doesn't allow us to draw any cards whatsoever. We're just retrieving cards out of the discard pile. And like I mentioned, ADP is definitely going to be a thorn in the side of a card like this as well. And not to mention prizing issues. If we prize even one Arrokuda, our damage just gets cut pretty substantially, which makes this card a good bit worse. So those are some of my big reservations about this sort of archetype. But at the same time, I do still have a soft spot for this sort of archetype. I feel like there's going to be a lot of deck space available to you to maybe play some additional cards like Oricorio GX or some alternate ways of drawing cards in a turn to get around the fact that you do need to play Nessa most of the time. So for that reason, guys, I'm going to remain neutral on Cramorant. This is definitely a deck we will for sure cover on the channel at some point, but it definitely has some things going against it as well, which is sort of keeping my expectations, a little bit in check for the moment, but definitely an interesting card for sure, and I definitely think it warrants some experimenting. Up next, we're going to be taking a look at Pikachu V-max, the big mascot of Vivid Voltage here. So of course, before we look at the V-max, we do need to take a look at the base form Pikachu. And I actually do think Pikachu V has a solid first attack here for just a single lightning energy. You search your deck for up to 2 lightning energy and attach them to this Pokemon. So this is definitely, I think, a good attack just because we did lose Thunder Mountain in the rotation. So any extra lightning acceleration we can get is going to be, I think, definitely welcome at this point. But Pikachu VMAX here is a VMAX with 310 HP, fighting weakness, and 2 retreat. And its only attack for 3 lightning energy does 120, and you may discard all energy attached to this Pokemon. If you do, this does 150 more damage. So unfortunately, I think Pikachu is kind of a victim of the way that Pokemon tends to release their sets. This card was originally released in Japan with access to Electropower. So for Japanese players, whenever they got this card, they could actually scale this attack to bypass that 300 mark, whereas the rest of the world is playing a format that doesn't have Electropower anymore, which means Pikachu is going to be capped out at 270. Which I think actually makes this card pretty substantially worse than it otherwise would have been, because right now, yes, we can knock out things like Mewtwo Mew, Zacian V, but we are 10 damage short of knocking out something like ADP, and of course, we can't one-shot tag teams unlike it would have been able to with Electropower still in the format. The other big issue about this card compared to other very similar VMAXs is the fact that it just doesn't have a great form of energy acceleration. So while something like Rillaboom VMAX does have a very similar attack that does take an additional energy, to be fair, Rillaboom has a pretty consistent form of energy acceleration once it gets up and running, but Pikachu is definitely a lot more awkward. Of course, we have something like Tapu Koko Prism Star to help us out a little bit, but then we have to start looking towards other things like maybe the new Electrode, which unfortunately does give up prizes whenever it knocks itself out, or something like Rose, which has largely up until this point kind of flopped so far anyways. So I just have to say it's really hard for me to get excited about this Pikachu when there's so many other VMAXs that have almost identical attacks, do them in a much, much better way. So it's hard to think off the top of my head, but it's been a while since I can remember that we've had a set that has like a main mascot like this that has been so bad. And okay, I shouldn't even really call Pikachu bad because you can, I think, build a deck around this thing. It will function, it will work just fine. But there's just other VMAXs that do the same thing but better. If I want to hit 270 with a VMAX, I'm just going to play Eternatus at this point. It can do the same thing, has a great engine, attacks for only 2 energy, doesn't have to discard its energy, has more HP as well. So I just don't see the case be made for Pikachu. Like, I guess in theory we can knock out some stuff like Cramorant or like Inteleon, but man, if we're playing Lightning, Pikachu is definitely not the partner I want to be playing right now. I think if I'm playing a Lightning deck, it's going to be something more like Pikarom or maybe some sort of Bolton deck or basically really just anything else. So unfortunately, I think Pikachu is just releasing into the wrong format internationally speaking. Like I said, Japan had Electropower as far as I'm aware of, whereas we do not, making Pikachu, I think, a substantially worse card. So unfortunately, guys, gonna have to downvote Pikachu VMAX here. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at a new Electrode. Electrode is a stage 1 Pokemon, and it has this ability once during your turn before you attack. If this Pokemon is on your bench, you may knock out this Pokemon. If you do, search your deck for up to 2 lightning energies and attach them to your lightning Pokemon, any way that you like, then shuffle your deck. And then from there just has a vanilla 100 damage attack. So clearly the star of the show is going to be this ability, and this is actually pretty similar to various other Electrodes we've had over the years. And, you know, most of them have seen varying different degrees of success, which actually does give me some hope for the future of this card. The one it probably most closely resembles is actually the Electrode back from Eeveelutions that effectively did the same thing, though instead of getting energy out of your deck, it turned itself into energy. And this in a way might even be a little bit better just because you're taking cards out of your deck and thinning your deck in the process. And luckily for Electrode, there's actually a good bit of different lightning Pokemon floating around in the game currently. Of course, we just looked at Pikachu V-max. That's going to be probably one of the big ones that's on people's mind when looking through Vivid Voltage. But of course, we have some old favorites like Pikachu Zekrom GX or even Bolton V. And I think if we're playing Electrode, I'm probably thinking of using this card more so in the case of one of the tag team decks. And the reason for that is because even though we are knocking ourselves out and giving up a prize, we can in theory knock out 2 Electrodes and it effectively doesn't change the outcome of the game. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're playing like a Greens Pikarom or like a Greens Pikachu V-max, just as an example. You knock out 2 Electrodes, get a bunch of energy into play, your opponent's down to 4 prizes left, they knock out a Pikarom, they're down to 1 prize, and they still from there have to knock out another tag team if they do want to win the games. That's a good thing about this in those specific types of decks, like we've seen with Mismagius and Magneton more recently. So I'm actually perfectly okay with the fact that Electrode knocks itself out. Where my reservation actually comes from is the partners that it has access to right now. In the case of Pikarom, I think Pikarom is already getting set up pretty decently even now in a format without something like Thunder Mountain, thanks to cards like Bolton and Tapu Koko Prism Star. And Pikachu V-max, on the other hand, I just don't think is that solid of an option. I mean, and even looking deeper into the card pool, whether it's something like Vikavolt V or Toxtricity V-max, I still don't think that changes no matter the partner we're sort of looking at. So I think in a vacuum, this ability is fine. I just think in practice right now, that perfect partner for this card doesn't quite exist. But nevertheless, I do like this ability. These abilities on Electrodes over the years have been good, whether it's Electrode Prime, Electrode from Eeveelutions, even Electrode EX, going all the way back to, I believe it was Fire Red, Leaf Green. These Electrodes have been good in different capacities. So for that reason, I am going to stay neutral on Electrode. This is definitely a card that could see play, just I'm not sure in the short term such a partner is going to exist for it. Up next, we have a new Zapdos card. Zapdos is a basic Pokemon, 110 HP, lightning weakness, fighting resistance when retreat cost. Has 2 different attacks, the first of which is just a vanilla 20 for a colorless, but then its more interesting attack. For 2 lightning and a colorless, you discard all energy attached to this Pokemon. If you do, this attack does 160 to one of your opponent's Pokemon V or Pokemon GX. And of course, we don't apply weakness or resistance for bench Pokemon. So of course, Zapdos is going to sort of harken back to the Cramorant V that we already have in format, but of course, big upside to Zapdos, it is a single prizer. Now, of course, its attack is limited to strictly Pokemon GX and V, and it has to attack for only lightning energy. But I think most of the time with Cramorant, you're using it to snipe the Denes anyways, so Zapdos really isn't going to be too different in that regard. However, the discard effect is something that I do think is a little bit annoying in the current format, but I do still think this could be a theoretical one-of in something like Pikarom, just because Tag Bolt is already such a good attack that can snipe different Pokemon, and being able to have another Pokemon in your list even after you've burned your GX attack that can snipe another Dedenne, it does seem like something that is pretty good. Or of course, it can just clean up knockouts on existing damaged Pokemon V and GX. That also seems fine as well. And ideally, I think I would imagine Zapdos probably as like a late game finisher, just because after you use this attack once, you're more than likely not going to be able to power it up again. But in the mid game, being able to go full blitz, you know, power up a Zapdos, then on the next turn you can Tag Bolt and have Zapdos ready to go on the following turn seems like a really cool line of play. Maybe in some sort of designated Bolton deck, this could be a potential finisher as well for kind of a similar reason. Just in general, I do kind of like this card, like I said, as a finisher. This is not a deck we are building around, or even a card I imagine we're ever going to play more than 2 copies of at the very most. But this is definitely still a card that has some degree of potential. This is one of those more neutral ratings that I'm leaning a little bit more to the positive side on, just because I do see plenty of practical application for this card since Dedenne GX is still such a prevalent card in the game right now. but the discard effect is kind of hefty for this card, and being limited to just Lightning Energy and Pokemon GX or V do make it a little bit more limiting than something like Cramorant as well. So I'm going to remain neutral, but I will not be surprised whatsoever if Zapdos is a card that does start to pop up in different Lightning decks as time goes on. Next up, we have another Pokemon V in the form of Ampharos V. So Ampharos here, of course, basic Pokemon, 210 HP, fighting weakness, 3 retreat cost. Has 2 different attacks, the first of which, for a lightning and colorless, does 50, and your opponent's active is now confused. And its second attack for 2 lightning and a colorless does 120 and does 30 damage to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon that already have damage counters on them. And of course, we're not going to apply weakness and resistance for benched Pokemon. So Ampharos is the second of the bad Pokemon in the set that could theoretically abuse the new telephotoscope that we mentioned when talking about Galarian Darmanitan V-max. And just overall, I'm not like the biggest fan of this card, to be honest, guys. You know, lightning Pokemon are kind of like fire Pokemon in the sense that there's so many strong ones that are in the card pool. Whenever a new one gets printed, you have to really ask yourself, man, is this, if we're playing a deck with lightning energy, especially a basic attacking deck with lightning energy, is this really better than just playing Pikarom or any of the other good lightning attackers that still exist? And that's where Ampharos starts to lose me. So the first attack is fine, whatever, but the second attack is really where I think people might want to look at when deciding if they want to build around this. 120 for 3 is definitely not very strong, especially in a format without Electro Power. Now, of course, Japan did have Electro Power when this card was printed, but for us internationally, we don't have that. And as a result, this attack is just not nearly as strong as it probably should be. But that being said, I do want to highlight some different deck building ideas I've been thinking about for Ampharos V lately. The first of which is actually going to be around Orbeetle V-max. So of course, the big thing with Orbeetle is that it can put 1 damage counter on each of your opponent's Pokemon. So that might actually be a more efficient way at spreading this damage instead of something like Galarian Zigzagoon, which of course is only going to put 1 damage counter on 1 Pokemon. Orbeetle will allow you to start doing that 30 spread to everything. And of course, we still have Roxy in the format as well, too. So we can use Roxy to discard Wheezings and Coughings, spread some damage counter, set up some math for Ampharos, and draw a bunch of cards in the process. So all that is fine and dandy, but again, guys, I'm just worried we're not going to be hitting quite enough to really make up for the lack of Electro Power in this format. I just look at this against like an ADP variant, and I'm just thinking, is there ever a world where we beat that at all? And that's where Ampharos is really starting to lose me a little bit. So I think just overall, this attack is just a little bit underpowered for where it needs to be. If we're attacking with a basic Pokemon V for 3 energy, you know, I'm probably going to do so with Zacian, that's for sure. I can use the same amount of energy, get powered up quickly with Metal Saucer, and be able to take 1-shots on opposing Pokemon V, and 2-shot any of the VMAXs in tag teams that exist. So yeah, Ampharos, I think it's just a little bit underpowered for where it needs to be. The second attack does have potential, and while I think you can successfully build a functioning Ampharos deck, I just don't think its damage output is going to be at the level necessary. Next up, we have another amazing rare Pokemon we're going to be looking at, and that is going to be Raiku. So Raiku is going to be a basic Pokemon with 110 HP, just has 1 singular attack here. For a Grass, Lightning, and Metal, it does 120, and then 120 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. As usual, don't apply weakness or resistance for bench Pokemon. And man, it seems like there's a lot of Pokemon in this set that are doing bench damage. That definitely seems to be a reoccurring theme here. And if we ignore Raiku's energy cost for a second, this is actually a really solid attack. 120, 120 snipe. But again, guys, the big thing with these amazing rares are these really annoying attack costs. Raiku is a little bit fortunate in its regard just because it can abuse lightning energy, which means Coco Prism is going to be an option to help cheat an extra attachment for your turn. But I have to say, I just really don't know what deck we are playing this thing in. I'm pretty sure I remember finding a pre-rotation amazing rare deck like a couple months ago that had like the new Jirachi, and just try to get everything powered up with that thing. And there's the new Picky Peck, which we'll be looking at later as well. But without actually like getting hands-on time with some of these cards, it's really hard to say if there is a possible way to get these things up and running. But while I like this attack, I just really don't have confidence that we can successfully get this thing set up. I just feel like by the time you finally get enough energy on this thing, it's going to get bossed off the bench, just going to get knocked out. And then from there, like, what else do you even play in a deck like this? I guess in theory you could play Bolton or Duraludon or some sort of like basic attacker that can accelerate energies. But yeah, I just really struggle to see the home for Raiku despite actually really liking this attack that we have here. I think one of the unfortunate things about this attack right now too, compared to, you know, maybe back during the XY era or the early Sun and Moon era, is that we don't have something like Shaman EX that sees play in every deck that gives up an easy 2 prizes that we can snipe with this 120. You know, the Dene is going to be out of range, even with something like Telephotoscope. Same thing for Crobat, same thing for Eldegoss. So while I still do like this attack, there's really not any current bench setters we can exploit in the same way that something like Cramorant V or the new Zapdos can. So between that and its awkward attack cost and really not having a home, I do have to downvote this Raikou. But if we can overcome this attack cost at some point, I do like this Raikou. This attack is good, but there's just a lot going against it simultaneously. Next up, we're going to be looking at a new Manectric. Manectric is going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon, 120 HP, Fighting Weakness, and a really nice free retreat cost as well. Always got to give props for having a free retreat cost. But it has this ability, which is really, I think, why we're discussing this. It says, once during your turn, whenever you play this card from hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may draw 3 cards. And then, of course, it just has kind of a mediocre 100 damage attack from there. But this ability is actually, I think, kind of neat. I did mention earlier in the set review when talking about Beedrill how good non-supporter based draw has been over the course of the game. And we've seen other of these sorts of like single prize bench sitting Pokemon that don't attack have success in the past. Most recently, we've seen Cinccino, Zebstrika. Going back further than that, there's even things like Octillery from Breakthrough. And the fact that we even have Scoop Up Net in the same format as this is pretty nice too, because that means we can reuse this ability over and over throughout the course of a game. But my issue with Manectric is that I think it honestly just takes up far too much deck space. So if we look back at some of these other cards like Zebstrika or Octillery, these are Pokemon where you can abuse their abilities every single turn. But with Manectric, this is a one-time ability. And if you want to reuse it, you have to dedicate 4 more spots in your deck to Scoop Up Net. And a lot of times, some of those other abilities that I just mentioned were actually stronger in certain situations. In the case of Octillery, you could draw until you had 5 cards. Sometimes that meant you drew more cards than Manectric. Same thing for Zebstrika. You could discard your hand, draw 4. And even beyond that, guys, we still have things like the Dene GX and Crobat V, which you only need to play 1 to 2 copies of in your deck. Whereas Manectric's going to require you to probably play at least 6 spots in your deck. Probably like a 2/2 Manectric and like 4 Scoop Up Nets, or maybe even more copies of Manectric in the deck. So you can see how much more deck space something like this requires compared to some of these Pokemon V and GX cards that currently exist in the game. So for the moment, I do have to pass on this. I think draw 3 is fine on ability. That's actually not bad, to be honest. Again, it just requires so much deck space if you want to keep reusing this sort of effect throughout the course of a game. So unfortunately, guys, I am going to pass on Manectric here. Next up, we have a new Zekrom card. Zekrom is going to be a basic Pokemon with 130 HP, Fighting Weakness, and a 3 retreat cost. And has 2 different attacks, first of which is just a vanilla 30 for 2, but its second attack is definitely a little bit more interesting. It's going to be 2 lightning for 130, and this Pokemon does 60 to itself, but your opponent's active is now paralyzed. So I say this a lot whenever we do our set reviews in these card discussions, but paralysis, especially auto paralysis, I think is one of the strongest sort of status conditions that we can inflict. So anytime we get a card that auto paralyzes your opponent, that's always a card I like to take a hard look at, and Zekrom is no exception. But unfortunately for Zekrom, we are in a format right now where it feels like almost every deck is playing Force Switch. It really does feel that way. And as a result, Zekrom gets a lot worse. Had this not been the case, like if we had been in a format like we were maybe 5 years ago or something like that, where the format was dominated by Floatstone rather than Switch, Zekrom actually might have been a good bit better because your opponent can't retreat with something like Floatstone or like an Air Balloon style card, making Zekrom a good bit better in those types of formats. But for the way that the game is right now, I just don't think this card is going to be good enough. Otherwise, it would have probably been a decent inclusion in Pikarom. You can go in with this thing, soften something up, paralyze them, much in the same way that Choo-Choo does. But this only gives up 1 prize, so I definitely could have easily seen how this could be good. But again, guys, as long as we're in a format that has every or most every deck playing a high count of Switch, I just don't think Zekrom's going to have a shot. A couple years ago, like I said, Zekrom would have been a great card. But unfortunately, things aren't looking so good for the guy. Next up, guys, we're going to be taking a look at Clefairy. And you heard that right. This is going to be Clefairy, not Clefable. Clefairy, I definitely think is going to be the more interesting out of this evolution line. Well, let's take a look at this guy. It's a basic Pokemon, of course, 60 HP, Metal Weakness, 1 Retreat. Has 2 different attacks, the first of which is pretty much what you would expect from a basic pre-evolution, just 1 Psychic Energy for 10, but much more interestingly, the second attack for 2 colorless energy, flip a coin, if heads, choose one of your opponent's active Pokemon's attacks, and use it as this attack. So suddenly this easily overlookable, is that a word? Card gets, I think, a lot more interesting just because we've seen a lot of these attacks over the years. I think one of the more notable examples of this is the Zoroark all the way back from Black and White. And even the Clefairy from Evolutions as well saw some play. So this is pretty cool because now on a coin flip with this puny little Clefairy for just a single twin energy, you can maybe copy something like Ultimate Ray or Full Blitz, whatever it might be. There's no shortage of very strong, heavy-hitting attacks running around in the game, and being able to copy them with just a one-prize, twin energy-based attacker like this really isn't too bad. And Clefairy actually might have some competitive potential just because we still have Fairy-type Clefables still in the format. What I mean by that is we're getting the new Memory Capsule tool card in Vivid Voltage that will allow Clefable to use attacks from Clefairy. So now we actually have a Fairy-based attacker in the format that can theoretically knock out ADP, which is usually one of the big obstacles for a lot of single prize decks. Now, I think really the big obstacle to a card like this is, of course, the need to play something like Glimwood Tangle. And I think that's really the thing that makes me a little bit reserved in terms of dishing out like a positive rating for this card, because otherwise this would be a super splashable card in any deck that has any mild form of energy acceleration or is playing something like Twin Energy. So now the Glimwood Tangle aspect of the card is kind of forcing us to only be able to play this in a Twin Energy based deck that is already playing Glimwood Tangle, or a deck that plays Glimwood Tangle that also has some form of energy acceleration. So that's really the limiting factor of Clefairy. If this was not a coin flip attack, I would say, yeah, this is absolutely great. Doesn't matter that it's a 60 HP Pokemon. Being able to copy some of these very strong attacks in the format that we have is amazing. But unfortunately, that's not the case, and my rating, I think, has to kind of reflect that a little bit. So definitely some ideas here for Clefairy worth exploring. I'm going to stay neutral on it. Definitely a cool card, but again, the coin flip aspect is kind of what has me, a little cautiously optimistic about the future of this card. Next up, we're going to be looking at Alakazam V. Very good to see Alakazam back in the game. This is definitely one of those Pokemon that very rarely gets represented due to some weird legal reasons. So always cool when they do find a way to actually be able to print Alakazam. But Alakazam V here, of course, a basic Pokemon V, 190 HP, so it is a little bit on the weaker side of our Pokemon V out there. Dark Weakness, Fighting Resistance, and a 1 Retreat. And its first attack for a Psychic Energy, put 3 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way that you like. And then for its second attack, for 2 Psychic Energy, just 30 damage times the amount of cards in your opponent's hand. So while it is exciting to see Alakazam return to the TCG, it's not quite as exciting from a competitive standpoint, just because Alakazam is not the strongest card that we're going to be looking at in this set review. The first attack, it's a fine little early game attack just to get some chip damage on the board. But second attack really doesn't hit in the way that I think I would like this thing to. If your opponent has a 6-card hand, you're going to be hitting for 180. And that's only 180. And that's with a pretty large hand size. By and large, Welder decks are one of the few decks that gradually sort of increase their hand size. But most decks are playing cards like Marnie, Professor's Research. They're not actually expanding their hand size. They're just dumping their hand and refreshing it to 5 or 7. And if that's the case, Alakazam's just really not hitting at the level it needs to. We can't knock out Zacian V. That's really, I think, the litmus test for these styles of cards that we're seeing printed. I mean, I guess technically you can, but it does require some sort of awkward card inclusions in your theoretical Alakazam V deck. You'd have to play cards like Surprise Box or even the new Alcremie that can make your opponent draw a card. We do have Turbo Patch at the very least to help power this thing up. So Alakazam, I mean, it's like not the worst card in this set by any means at all, but I just don't think its attack is strong enough just because your opponent can play around this and manipulate your own damage output. So, I mean, if we're playing Alakazam, I imagine this would be a card that maybe eventually sees play as just sort of a backup attacker. I just don't think you can successfully build around this with the current state of the game the way it is. So for that reason, guys, I mean, you kind of hate to see it when a Pokemon like this only gets printed once every so rarely. But yeah, gonna have to pass on Alakazam V here. Misses the mark just a little bit. Next up, guys, we have ourselves a new Banette. Banette is a stage 1 Pokemon, has an ability here. It says, once during your turn, when you play this card from your hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may de-evolve one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and put the highest stage evolution card on it into your opponent's hand. Then just has kind of a generic 2 energy for 40 attack. We've seen these devolution style effects be very good in the past with things like Espeon EX and the Jirachi going all the way back to, oh man, I forget which Heart Gold Soul Silver set it was, but the Jirachi from that era also saw some play for its devolution effects as well. So this is definitely a good effect, but the issue is, largely speaking, we're really not in an evolution-based format right now. I think the closest thing we have is going to be VMAXs, but unlike your traditional stage 2s, it's kind of hard to get enough damage on them to where a devolution play will knock them out. So take something like a Decidueye, for example, where your base form route is only 50 HP or 60 HP. It's really not that hard to get that 50 or 60 damage on that sort of stage 2 Pokemon, then de-evolve it. But if we're looking at a VMAX where the base forms have over 200 HP, that's a little bit clunkier to set up that sort of devolution play that I'm kind of illustrating here. Now, the one good thing about Banette 2 is the fact that it does have access to Scoop Up Net, so that's one thing it does have going for it. We do also have some spreading options in the format right now, like Flapple and Weezing, so Banette naturally sort of pairs nicely with those styles of Pokemon. We also have Fion to guarantee that we can force our opponent to always be on the bench for the Pokemon that we want to de-evolve. So there's definitely good things going for Banette, but this is a stage 1 coming into a format where evolution Pokemon just really aren't the most dominant. Despite this ability actually kind of being decent, I think this is another one of those cards that we've looked at in this set review that's just sort of releasing into the game at the wrong point in time. So Banette, unfortunately, we are going to have to downvote this one. But of course, if the meta does shift over the course of the next several sets and evolution Pokemon, especially one prize evolution Pokemon, do sort of start to become the norm, Banette might have a chance to see some play. But for the moment, that just does not look to be the case. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at Dusknoir. So Dusknoir is a stage 2 Pokemon, 150 HP, dark weakness, fighting resistance, and 2 retreat cost. It has this ability, as long as this Pokemon is in play, special energy cards attached to each player's Pokemon have no effect and now provide 1 colorless energy. And then, of course, has just kind of a trash 3 energy attack for 120. So this is actually a very impressive ability. This card kind of reminds me of Shiftry in a way, just in the sense that both those cards have some of the strongest abilities actually of any cards in the set, but the other factors that are kind of surround these cards mean that they probably won't see play. So this is actually a really sick ability because you are going to turn things like Twin Energies into Colorless Energies, Aurora Energies, Speed Lightnings, Triple Acceleration Energies. You know, just turning those into colorless energies can be so damaging against a number of different decks. And we've seen this style of ability be good in the past. This is actually very similar to the old Crystal Beach Stadium from many, many sets ago, which is a card that did see play. Because of the disruption, it did cause these special energy-based decks. The issue I'm seeing for Dusknoir right now is the fact, of course, that it's on a stage 2. And unlike maybe back during like the Sun and Moon era where we had Zoroark GX and these double colorless energy based decks running around, I don't think we have any sort of twin energy based deck or special energy based deck that is just running amok, that is just so prevalent that we need to play a stage 2 to attempt to counter them. I guess if the Cosmic Eclipse Dusknoir ever does become more viable, this could be a decent one of in that deck, maybe, but I really just can't see many other good uses for this card right now. If this was like a stage 1, you know, maybe we'd be in business. But again, being a stage 2, being forced to play things like rare candies or evolving manually twice just seems like such a big request to get this thing out. So again, much like with Shiftry, love this ability, think this is great, but again, it's on a stage 2 that's going to be kind of awkward to get out, that also can't really attack. So for the moment, going to pass on Dusknoir. Next up, guys, we're going to be talking about a pair of cards here that is going to be Whimsicott and Garbodor. So both these cards do something very differently, but I feel like the discussion for each of these was kind of based around one another. So we're going to discuss both of them here. So we have Whimsicott up first. It's a stage 1. Its first attack allows you to draw 3 for a colorless, and more interestingly, its second attack for a psychic energy. You may discard as many tool cards from your Pokemon as you like. This attack does 40 more for each Pokemon tool discarded in this way. And then Garbodor is also, of course, a stage 1. And we're really just looking at for the first attack here for 2 colorless energy, or just a twin energy, of course. It does 30 times the amount of Pokemon tool cards in your discard pile, then shuffle them into your deck. So this is definitely a very interesting sort of suite of cards that we have here. You can see the synergy. You know, Whimsicott's going to be ideally your early game attacker in this archetype they're sort of pushing. And then the late game, you know, you're going to play probably like a 2/2 Garbodor to come in with Garb Cyclone and do some big damage to close out a game with. So let's just run through the math on these really quick. If we're talking about Whimsicott here, if we have a tool card attached to each of our Pokemon, we can max out at 250 for this thing, which is pretty good. That knocks out all of our base form Pokemon V, can even knock out Pikarom. So yeah, we're in business. This is a solid little 1 energy attack on a stage 1. But I have to say, I actually do like Whimsicott a good bit. I think Garbodor is also okay. But Whimsicott's really the Pokemon here that I think I like the most, just because we still have U-turn board in the format. And what I mean by that is U-turn board, whenever we discard it from play, it comes back into our hand, which is huge because now suddenly you don't have to cram quite as many tool cards in your theoretical Whimsicott deck for it to function properly. Assuming you don't prize any, every time you attack a Whimsicott, you're going to get 4 tools back into your hand, and you just have to find 2 more, assuming you're discarding all 6 from play. Now, that suddenly starts to look a lot more manageable. Instead of having to find 6 tools every turn, you just need to find 2. Now, of course, things like Marnie exist, and that is something you will have to sort of, I think, build your list to attempt to counter against a little bit. We even have the Greedent from a few sets ago that will allow you to search your deck for a tool card. So that's something you could theoretically think to play in this deck. We have Lana's Fishing Rod to retrieve tool cards as well. So I feel like the pieces are all kind of here. And one thing I do like about Whimsicott in particular is the fact that it is a psychic type. Now, of course, if this was a fairy type, like it probably would have been before fairies got canceled in Pokemon, this would be a really good ADP counter. But because it's on psychic type, we can actually still use Latios GX potentially as a way to get around altered creation, which is something I actually do like, is one of the main reasons I am sort of excited for this card. So I think you can go probably a couple different ways with this. I think you can actually probably play Whimsicott just on its own, or if you want to play Garbodor in Twin Energy, that also seems solid as well. So I'm actually going to stand beside this combo of cards more specifically for Whimsicott. I think Whimsicott's definitely the star of these 2 Pokemon, but Garbodor also seems okay and definitely worth considering for your Whimsicott decks. So yeah, I'm a fan. I think this is one of the better 1 prize Pokemon that we're getting from Vivid Voltage. Up next, we have another amazing rare, and that's going to be Zacian. Zacian, of course, basic Pokemon, Metal Weakness to Retreat. And its first attack here for a colorless energy does 30, and you attach a basic energy from discard to this Pokemon. And its second attack for a grass, psychic, and metal, it does 150. And if your opponent has a Pokemon V-max in play, this attack does 150 more damage. So this is a little bit more intriguing, I think, than some of the other amazing rares we've looked at up until this point. So one of the first things I do like is the fact that it has a solid first attack to sort of lead the game with. It synergizes very nicely with the insufferable attack costs on all of these amazing rares. So that is definitely good. But hitting for 300 for 3 on a single prize Pokemon, man, that's kind of hard to overlook, I do have to say. And one of the things I do like about this is that it just says if your opponent has a VMAX in play, which means you don't have to actually attack into a VMAX. So if they're attacking you with some sort of 2 prizer, you still get that 150 buff, which is really, really cool. And one of the things I do like about this is only 30 damage shy of knocking out basically everything outside of Eternatus VMAX. And coincidentally, we do have a Pokemon that is very good at increasing damage by 30 for the rest of the game in the form of ADP. So actually, do you think we could see an Aurora energy based version of ADP in the future around these amazing rares? Or at the very least, Zacian here, just again, guys, being able to hit that 330 mark is insane with this card, especially too if you get in the chip 30 damage with this first attack, that could also be good. But outside of ADP, it does get a little bit foggier in terms of how we're going to play this thing. I have seen some Japanese deck lists for some like designated amazing rare decks that just go all in on accelerating energy with Jirachi. So maybe that's something we'll have to experiment with. This definitely seems like it would be an amazing attacker if that engine is successful. But ADP is definitely, I think, where I am a little bit more impressed with this card for the moment. But overall, guys, I do have to say I do like this card. The fact that we can play this with the ADP, fantastic. Love that. So I definitely think this one has some of the most potential out of any of the ones we've looked at up until this point. Next up, guys, we're going to be taking a look at a new Donphan, and actually Phanpy as well to a lesser degree here. But Donphan, of course, is going to be the core of the discussion. It's a Stage 1 Pokemon, Grass Weakness, 4 Retreat Cost, of course, also good because we can use buff padding if we do want to. But we're looking at Donphan mainly for his first attack here. It does 120 and then does 20 to each of your bench Pokemon. Don't apply weakness and resistance for bench Pokemon. Then its second attack for Stay Fighting, 2 colorist, a vanilla 90. So I think what's so interesting about this card, it's kind of just like a modern day version of the Donphan all the way back from the Heart Gold, Soul Silver era. And what's crazy, I remember at the time when Donphan Prime got revealed and it had Earthquake doing 60 for 1. I remember at the time people were like, 60 for 1 on a stage 1? That's crazy. And now we have a Donphan that's literally doubling that. And this card's like debatable if it's good. So it just kind of shows you how power creep really is in this game. But Donphan, I think this is kind of an interesting card. 120 for 1 is good. You're going to knock out things like Blacephalon, which is one of the more prevalent one prizers at the time of recording. And we can hit a couple of pretty popular cards for weakness, most notably Eternatus V-max and also Pikarom and other lightning attackers. By and large, you are going to have to 2-shot Eternatus, but it's fine. You're trading 2-hit knockouts for 3 prizes, whereas your opponent's trading 1-hit knockouts for 1. So you still come out ahead in the prize exchange. Now, the good news, we can knock out Pikarom either way. Being able to just nuke Pikarom for 1 energy on stage 1, yeah, that feels pretty good. And lately, Pikarom has been creeping back into the game a little bit more, so there might be some merit to that strategy. And honestly, even the 20 damage spread to the bench really isn't an issue for a few reasons with this card, because we do still have Spiritomb in format, and Spiritomb loves getting damage on itself. So Spiritomb could potentially be a backup attacker in the late game to sort of clean up some knockouts with. That definitely seems like an option. And also maybe even Phanpy. Phanpy actually has a pretty solid second attack for a fighting colorist, is 30 times the amount of damage counters on this Pokemon. Phanpy has 70 HP. If you have 6 damage counters, you're going to be hitting for 180. That's not too exciting, but we can actually use the new memory capsule card if we do decide to. And now we can have up to 14 damage counters on the Pokemon we are using the attack of, which is going to allow us to basically knock out anything that we want to at that point. But I'm still unsure if this is a deck that would actually be able to beat ADP. So that's, I think, where Donphan might sort of struggle. But I do like this card, guys. I mean, 120 for 1 on a stage 1, really not bad. There are still some different forms of fighting support in the form of Martial Arts Dojo and Karate Belt. We have Spiritomb, which pairs nicely. We have Memory Capsule. So I think there's some good things here. And that's why I am going to remain neutral on this card. But again, just the big issue a lot of these types of cards are facing right now is ADP. And it's just hard to say if the meta is going to shift enough away from ADP for this card to have enough good matchups to carry it through an entire tournament. Next up, we have another Pokemon VMAX, and that is going to be Coalossal VMAX. So, of course, before we get to the VMAX, just briefly touch on the base form Coalossal V. So it's 220 HP, basic, grass weakness for retreat. It has 2 different attacks, the first of which for 2 fighting and a colorist is 90 and your opponent's active is now burned. And its second attack for 3 fighting and a colorist just does a vanilla 180. So Coalossal V, not too impressive, I don't think, but Coalossal VMAX I think definitely has a bit more potential. So it's a VMAX 330 HP, grass weakness for retreat cost, and its first attack for a fighting energy does 40, and you discard 1 card from the top of your deck. If that card is an energy, this attack does 90 more, then attach that energy to this Pokemon. And its second attack for 3 fighting and a colorist is 240. So yeah, Coalossal does have a pretty heavy hitting second attack, but really this first attack is where I am most excited. This is an attack that's very energy efficient, has a good damage to energy ratio, gets you some extra acceleration, and is pretty easy to fulfill. You know, we have things like Rotom Phone, Chip Ice Axe, but more importantly, we still have a Rangaroo with Primate Wisdom, so now we can use Primate Wisdom to put an energy on top of our deck, then attach it with this Pokemon. And one thing I do like about this too is that it does not specify basic energy, so that means we actually can abuse the new Stone Fighting Energy with this attack and ensure that we can get the added tanking options that card is going to give us. So one of the things I do think is important about this is that with a Martial Arts Dojo in play and us being behind on prizes, we can actually one-shot a clean Eternatus V-max because we're going to be doing 130. Plus 40 is 170 times 2, 340, knocking out Eternatus. So that is awesome. I'm sure this was not a coincidence they're releasing this card right after Darkness Ablaze. So Coalossal VMAX checks most of the boxes I'm looking for in a card. Unless you're some sort of weird anti-meta deck or control deck, you need to be able to one-shot 1 prizers, one-shot 2 prizers, and 2-shot or 1-shot 3 prizers, and Coalossal definitely can do that. So with Stone Fighting Energy, we can buff this thing a little bit more, give it some tank ability. For retreat cost means we can even play buff padding if we want to keep doubling down on that strategy. We have Madeline Lana still, we have Hyper Potion. So guys, I am a fan of Coalossal here. While it doesn't have some of the shock value of its damage output compared to some of the other VMAXs, I think this thing hits for the numbers that it needs to. It's a good type right now to be in the game. And it's pretty easy to get set up, unlike most of the VMAXs, which have these really hefty attack costs that require other things like stage 1 or stage 2s to get set up. This guy's pretty self-sufficient and really just needs a couple of Oranguru to get going. And I think that's pretty manageable. So I do like Coalossal. Definitely think it's one of the better cards we've seen so far in this set. Next up, we have another amazing rare, and that is going to be Zamazenta. Zamazenta is going to be a fighting Pokemon here, 110 HP, Psychic Weakness to Retreat cost, and its first attack, much like Zacian, same attack actually, Colorless Energy, 30, and then you attach a basic energy from discard to this Pokemon. And that second attack for a Lightning, Fighting, and Metal does 180, and this Pokemon takes no damage from the attacks of Pokemon VMAX during your opponent's next turn. So Zamazenta is actually one of the more interesting amazing rares in the sense that this is, I believe, the only one you could theoretically power up in one turn without the help of some sort of evolution or some sort of attack-based form of energy acceleration, because if we're behind on prizes, we can attach a Metal, burn Cocoa Prism Star to accelerate a Lightning, and use Karate Belt to actually attack with this thing for basically one Metal attachment and hit for 180 and wall against VMAXs. So that seems pretty sick. Now, how often is that going to happen? I mean, that's going to be up for debate for that exact scenario to be able to occur. But one of the gripes I do have with this compared to Zacian is that Zacian's attack is a little bit more flexible. And what I mean by that is your opponent just needs to have a VMAX in play for you to get its massive damage buff, whereas this is only limited from preventing damage from VMAXs. So Zacian gets its benefit no matter who it's attacking into, whereas Zamazenta really doesn't. And that's kind of my issue with this card. Again, this is another one of those cards where I just look at this and think, well, what deck are we even playing this in? I think that's going to be one of the big questions overall here. I don't know if we're playing the amazing ADP style deck with amazing rares, Aurora Energies, Guzmahalas, all that stuff. But I'm really not sure what this is accomplishing that just playing Zamazenta V won't already accomplish. And Zamazenta V is going to be a much easier card to get powered up sort of across the board, no matter what matchup you're going against. Where on the other hand, the Zacian we already looked at provides something kind of unique that doesn't really overlap with any other existing card. So that's kind of my issue with this. It's walling against VMAXs, but Zamazenta V can already do that, and it's not an attack. Granted, it can't one-shot Eternatus, so that's the one thing this Zamazenta has going for it. But overall, I'm just not sure of the need for this card when Zamazenta V exists. I mean, again, guys, it kind of depends. Like, if the standalone amazing rare deck does sort of become a thing at some point, I think maybe this Zamazenta could be good in that, of course. So for that reason, guys, I do like this card. It has the solid first attack that Zacian has. Walling against VMAX is good, can one-shot Eternatus, only gives it one prize. There's good things going on here. And as a result, I think I'm just going to remain a little bit neutral on this one. Next up, we're going to be looking at another new Pokemon V, and that is going to be Drapion V. So Drapion, of course, is a basic Pokemon. This one has 210 HP, Fighting Weakness, and a 3 retreat cost. It has 2 different attacks, the first of which is going to be for a Dark and 2 colors, just does kind of a vanilla 70 damage. But the second attack is a little bit more interesting. For a Dark and 3 colorist does 130, and you discard 2 energy attached to this Pokemon, and leave your opponent's active Pokemon poisoned and paralyzed. So both these attacks I do think are a little bit underwhelming in terms of their damage output. This second attack definitely is kind of interesting in terms of the status conditions that it can inflict. After you calculate for poison, you're effectively doing 140, and then with auto paralysis, fingers crossed your opponent doesn't have switch, but then they can't attack on the next turn as well. So anytime we get auto paralysis, I always sort of try to take note of these cards just because auto paralysis is one of the stronger status effects that we can inflict. But Drapion definitely has some pretty big issues, I think, to overcome. 3 for 70 is pretty abysmal when you compare that to Brave Blade on Zacian V. That does 230 for effectively the same amount of energy. 130 for 4, not too much better in that regard, but I can kind of overlook the low damage output of the second attack in theory, just because we're trying to make our opponent not be able to move from the active spot, and we are basically counting on getting an additional hit in after we attack with this thing. Then the other big gripe I have right now is just that we're in a format that's dominated by decks that play 4 copies of Switch. And at that point, you're just doing 140 and discarding 2 energy from yourself. This card actually really reminds me a lot of Torkoal V. They both have kind of a similar second attack. They require 4 energy. They have kind of a low damage output. And then the secondary effect of the attack is attempting to prevent your opponent from getting off an attack on the next turn. But I think Torkoal just does a much better job of this because stripping the energy, I think, is generally going to be a more reliable way at setting your opponent back in the current format, just because them playing Switch isn't going to ruin your strategy like it will with Drapion here. The other thing we do have to kind of address with this card is the energy cost. So of course you can look to some of the dark energy accelerators like Hydreigon or Weavile GX, but really I think if you're playing this, I think Wailord is just the best way to go since the energy cost is primarily colorless based. But overall, guys, I mean, I'm just not a big fan of this. I think if you want to go down this route, Torkoal is just a better way to do that. Now, if down the road we get something like a Floatstone reprint and that becomes like the dominant form of switching, then Drapion has a much better shot at succeeding. But right now, since the primary way at giving your board mobility is switch, this attack I think really is going to have a hard time actually landing and sticking for a turn. So for that reason, guys, I'm going to have to pass on Drapion. Definitely not one of my favorite cards at all from this set. Next up, we're going to be looking at the Krookodile Evolution line. All 3 of the Pokemon in this line have a very similar attack, but of course, Krookodile is going to be sort of the main one we want to focus on. But they all have this same attack for 4 energy, 3 energy, and 2 energy respectively between Sandile, Krokorok, and Krookodile. We can discard 3 cards from the top of our opponent's deck. So we have kind of like a mill strategy that we have here. And I do want to point out, I actually do kind of like how they themed this whole evolution line. You know, the more you evolve, the lower your attack cost. So that's a cool thing about this. I really do like the way they themed this whole evolution line. But unfortunately, from a competitive standpoint, I just don't think this milling effect is super good right now. If I'm going to play a control deck, I think I'd rather just play Excadrill, or if I want like a designated mill Pokemon, I'd probably rather just play the Toxtricity deck, even though that deck is largely based around coin flips. Just getting out Krookodile alone is going to be kind of a challenge just because it is a stage 2. Luckily, we do have some cards in the format to make this a little bit easier. We have things like Green's Exploration and even Piers to maybe search out some of those combo pieces. You know, getting out of stage 2 just to discard 3 cards seems a little bit weak, especially when we compare this to other milling cards we've had over the years. We even have like the Durant going back to Noble Victories that can discard 4 as a basic. So when we look at something like this by comparison, this doesn't seem nearly as good. Now, even though I do like the way this evolution line is designed, I think the way they could have done this to make this actually maybe somewhat viable is instead of lowering the attack cost, it would have been great if all of these Pokemon had a 2 energy attack cost, but the amount of cards that you mill as you evolve through the evolution line increases. So ideally, I think I would have rather have seen all of them attack for a twin energy, but then Sandile discards 3, Krokorok discards 4, Krookodile discards 5. I think that's really the way I would have liked to have seen this evolution line be designed. But since that's not what we wound up with, I don't think this Krookodile line is very good at all. Like I said, guys, if you want to play one of these sort of like meme mill decks, I would rather just play Palossand or Toxtricity if given the choice. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at Steelix V. Steelix V is a basic Pokemon, 250 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 4 retreat cost. And Steelix has 2 different attacks here, the first of which for a Metal and Colorless does 30 plus 10 more for each damage counter on this Pokemon. And its other attack for a Metal and 4 Colorless does 210, and this Pokemon does 30 damage to itself. So let's get the good out of the way for this card to begin with. 250 HP, absolutely massive. That is a great number of HP on a 2-prizer. Pikachu by comparison only has 240 HP and gives up 3 prizes. So Steelix is definitely a tank, which is a great thing for its typing, given that Metal does have so much support in terms of being able to heal and reduce damage. So of course we have things like Lucario and Melmetal GX, Cape of Toughness, Buff Padding, Metal Goggles, Metal Core Barrier. There's no shortage of things to reduce damage done to Steelix. That's definitely good. And that all sort of pairs well, actually with this first attack, 30 plus 10 for each damage counter on this Pokemon. You know, if they have 240 on you, then you're gonna be able to hit for 270, knocking out tag teams. Now, to be fair, I do think it's going to be a little bit challenging to hit that exact sort of amount of damage, but it is nice that Steelix does have this kind of one-hit KO potential. But that's about where my enthusiasm is going to end for this card. I feel like a lot of the time you're just going to be forced into awkward lines of play to just end up doing the same thing that Zacian does, or maybe even sometimes to a lesser degree, which doesn't seem too exciting. Most of the time, I think you're just going to end up being kind of like a mediocre Zacian, just because this first attack is one that your opponent can play around and they can sort of choose their path of doing damage based on ensuring that you're not going to be able to return KO them once you've gotten a certain amount of damage on your Steelix. And then from there, the other attack is just bad. I mean, 5 for 210. I mean, again, I hate bringing up Zacian continuously throughout these card discussions, but again, if we're looking at a Pokemon V, especially a Metal Pokemon V, why would we do 210 for 5 and take 30 damage when we could do 230 for 3 and have a downside that's like almost irrelevant, plus have an insane ability on top of that? So yeah, Steelix is the card that definitely is going to be living in the shadow of some of the other strong Metal Pokemon that we have running around. Yeah, this first attack is interesting. It's cute. You can definitely tank with Steelix, but the big issue is going to be balancing your damage reduction modifiers in a way that doesn't reduce your opponent's damage too much to where you're not doing meaningful damage while also still trying to tank at the same time. So yeah, as you guys can probably tell, this is going to be a hard pass for me on Steelix V. Next up, we have another amazing rare, and that is going to be Jirachi. Jirachi is a basic Pokemon, 70 HP, has this ability once during your turn. If this Pokemon is your active, you may look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put one of them into your hand, and return the other one on top of your deck. And it's only attack here for a Psychic, Fighting, and Metal Energy. You search your deck for up to 7 basic energy cards and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like, then shuffle your deck. Yeah, so I think Jirachi is definitely one of the best of the amazing rares that we've seen so far. Granted, that's not saying too much, but I definitely think this card has some degree of potential. This ability is actually pretty decent. It's very similar to the Pidgeotto that we have still in the format, very similar to the Musharna all the way back from the Black and White era. And the one thing this Jirachi does have going for it over the Stellar Wish Jirachi is the fact that we actually have the appropriate tool card to allow it to freely retreat. So what I mean by that is we did lose a skateboard in this past year's rotation, making our Jirachis a little bit more cumbersome to use than they previously were. But with this one, all we need is a U-turn board, and we can freely retreat these Jirachis over and over. So that is one thing this Jirachi does have going for it. Now I know the reach of this ability is not quite as deep as Stellar Wish is, since Stellar Wish is looking at 5 cards, but this ability is a little bit more flexible in a way because you can grab any card. So do I think this is going to be a replacement for the Stellar Wish Jirachi? No, I do not. I think this would probably see play in decks that aren't relying on Scoop Up Net. So one of the upsides to playing the Stellar Wish Jirachi is the fact that you basically have to play Scoop Up Net right now. And if you're playing Scoop Up Net, that gives you access to a bunch of other basic Pokemon like Galarian Zigzagoon, Giratina, Mewtwo, etc. that can also abuse that. But if you're a deck that isn't looking to use those tools, maybe Jirachi can be a consideration, especially if just having the pivot Pokemon in between turns is particularly valuable in your deck. So I think there's a world where a Jirachi like this might help those styles of decks a little bit more than the Stellar Wish based Jirachi, just because you won't have to run quite as many switching cards. And once you find a U-turn board, you're guaranteed to have a free retreater in between every knockout. But also I do want to highlight, I do think this attack does have some potential as well here. While this is definitely a pretty insufferable attack cost, like most of the other amazing rares that we've looked at so far, one of the nice things about this is the fact that we can use Metal Saucer on it. So between Metal Saucer, Turbo Patch, and a manual attachment for turn, I can actually see a world where we are using this attack turn 1, or at the very least turn 2 if we went first. So if we are able to kind of consistently get this attack off in the early turns of the game, amazing rares actually might potentially have an energy acceleration engine outside of something like ADP, which is sort of the main one I've been thinking of personally, in the form of this Jirachi. And that seems kind of exciting because you probably are already going to run 4 of these in your deck just to increase your odds of starting with them. And each Jirachi that you can play is going to get you probably a little bit closer to pulling off this attack as well. But just to be clear, I do still have some concerns if this whole amazing rare engine is going to actually be a thing. But again, guys, I do think you can make a case for this in very select decks to play this instead of maybe the Stellar Wish Jirachi. And of course, if we can get this attack up and running, this is a very powerful form of energy acceleration. So as a result, I'm going to go out on a limb here, stand beside Jirachi. Think this card is really cool. Definitely really looking forward to experimenting with it and see how it winds up doing. So next up, we have ourselves a new Dialga card. This is a basic Pokemon, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 2 retreat cost. It has 2 different attacks. The first one says attach up to 2 metal energy from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. And then its second attack for 2 metal and a colorless is 130, and you discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. So at a glance, I think some people might be excited for this Dialga just because of its first attack. Being able to power up like a Zacian on turn 1 with this thing, or a Lucario Melmetal, or even other weird things like Galarian Stunfisk V even, is something that is slightly enticing. And we've seen Duraludon up until this point also see some play while having a very similar first attack. Now, of course, the trade-off is Dialga doesn't actually do damage, whereas Duraludon does 30 and only gets 1 energy. So there is a bit of a trade-off, which is fair and balanced here. And second attack does hit a little bit harder as well, hitting for 130 instead of Duraludon's 110. But I'm actually not convinced that the extra energy or the extra damage particularly matters most of the time. You know, typically Duraludon has been seeing play in ADP variants, and after Altered Creation, the attack it has already kind of hits for the numbers that it needs to. And if you need to get in that 30 chip damage, sometimes that can make the difference between getting a KO and not getting a KO with your Zacian on following turns. So most of the time, I think it's going to be fine if people just continue to play Duraludon. The one area where Dialga could be a little bit better than that is the fact that after Altered Creation, its second attack can knock out Galarian Obstagoon, but I'd argue if you're playing against Obstagoon, you're not going to be able to do damage to it anyways, so it's like almost irrelevant. There would need to be some sort of situation that comes up where the extra damage here is particularly relevant for Dialga. And right now, I'm really not convinced that such a scenario exists in the game. So Dialga, while I really don't think this is a horrible card by any means at all, it's fine. It serves basically the same sort of utility that Duraludon has. But personally, I like having no downside to Duraludon's second attack. I also like getting in the 30 chip damage with its first attack as well. So for that reason, I'm probably going to pass on Dialga for the moment. If we do get maybe like a single prize deck that gets printed at some point where the extra damage from this attack is relevant, yeah, Dialga will probably see some play at that point. But again, I just don't see such a situation at the current present time. Next up, we have a new Pokemon V, and that is going to be Aegislash V. So this is actually part of a VMAX evolution line, but I do think there's enough utility for the base form here that it kind of warrants its own discussion. So looking at this card, it has 2 different attacks, the first of which for a metal and colorless is 50, and its second attack for 2 metal and colorless is 130, and you ignore all effects on your opponent's active Pokemon when doing this damage. So while Aegislash V isn't really the hardest hitting Pokemon, especially compared to the other metal attackers that we have in the game, the second attack is actually really good at dealing with some of these problematic anti-meta Pokemon like Decidueye and Altaria as an example. Now I know ADP variants in particular have played things like Duraludon in the past to deal with those decks, but Aegislash V is going to be much more difficult for those styles of decks to take a return KO on. You know, Duraludon has a pretty low amount of HP, and if they stagger their damage right with something like Decidueye or their Obstagoons, whatever it might be, they can pretty easily take down Duraludon, whereas Aegislash V, you're almost guaranteed to get 2 knockouts, which with ADP equates to 4 prizes. And I think this card's going to pull its weight much better than something like Duraludon. So we were actually just discussing when talking about Dialga, if Dialga is even better than Duraludon, but now I honestly don't know if Duraludon is even better than Aegislash V, just because this attack does cut through those annoying abilities. So as long as these sort of anti-meta Pokemon do exist in the game, I think Aegislash definitely has a home in other metal decks, whether it's ADP, which I think is the more likely of candidates, but also to a degree Lucario and Melmetal variants as well, if they do want a way to answer those Decidueyes, Altarias, etc. So I'm honestly kind of bummed that this card is even getting printed, because those are some of the only decent evolutions that we have in the format right now are the anti-meta ones that wall against basic Pokemon and Pokemon V and VMAX. So it's also kind of heartbreaking to see Pokemon just double down on killing all of the funnest aspects of this game and, you know, just making big basic decks even more viable. So I'm honestly really annoyed with this card's existence, but it's a solid card, guys. And again, as long as Decidueye and Altaria and Obstagoon are viable options, Aegislash V is going to be a card that remains on the table for people in their different metal decks that exist. So Aegislash V, unfortunately, a pretty solid card. Alright guys, like I said, we do have H/V, but it does have a VMAX in this set as well. So H/VMAX is a 320 HP VMAX, fire weakness, 3 retreat cost, grass resistance. And this guy just has one singular attack here for 2 metal and a colorist is 160, and does 30 more for each prize card you've taken. So if we just run through the math with this attack really quick, if we have taken 5 prize cards, we'll be hitting for 160 plus an additional 150, putting us at 310. And 310 is kind of an annoying number to hit for. There's only a few different VMAXs we can knock out with that. Think of like the new Orbeetle and the new Pikachu. But if we are playing this in ADP, of course, we can get that 3 damage buff to be able to hit things like Eternatus VMAX for a one-shot. So while that's fine, I just honestly don't know if ADP variants or metal decks in general right now need this attack. I think most of the time Zacian is just going to be a fine attacker. It's a basic, so it's much easier to get set up. I think just generally the solid stream of 260 over and over after an alt creation is going to trump having to get a VMAX into play on a very specific turn of the game. Because a lot of times you're not even going to take 5 prizes. A lot of times you're just going to take 3 by knocking out a VMAX, and then you still need another 3 prizes to take by knocking out an additional VMAX from there. And so a lot of times you're not even going to be able to hit that magic 310 amount. Now, the one thing that Aegislash does have going for it is its added tank ability. That's, I think, where you can make the case for this, because Zacian can be return KO'd, especially by opposing Zacians, just as an example. But Aegislash having 320 HP means that it's going to get in at least 2 hits. My gut tells me I'd rather just do 260 every turn until I win. So for that reason, I'm going to pass on H/VMAX. This card's okay, it's fine. There's nothing like egregiously bad about it, but again, I'm just not convinced that metal decks have enough reason to run this over its existing partners that they already have. Next up, we have Magearna. Magearna is going to be a basic Pokemon with 90 HP, 2 different attacks here. First of which, for a metal energy, shuffle your hand into your deck, then draw 6. And its second attack for a metal and colorist is 10 plus 20 times the amount of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So yet again, I think Magearna is going to fall into the same category as a lot of these other metal Pokemon we've been discussing, where it's not a horrible card, but there's really just not much of a need to play this given the current pool of attackers that different metal decks have to work with. And what I mean by that is the second attack at a glance does look pretty good, especially just being on a 1 prizer, but we already have Mawile GX in the format, which kind of does the same thing and also has a good ability. Like, yeah, I know Mawile is an easy bench target, has a low amount of HP, gives up 2 prizes, yada yada. I understand all that. But to give Magearna some credit, let's run through the math really quick on this thing. 10 plus 20. So of course this is going to be geared at dealing with something like Eternatus, just as an example. So if Eternatus has a full bench of 8, we can hit for 170, plus Altered Creation is going to get us to 200, which means we have a good Crobat killer that only gives up 1 prize. So being able to take 2 prizes with this thing and only give up 1 prize compared to our Zacians. But again, guys, where I'm at, I kind of just want to stick with Mawile. Being able to look at your opponent's hand alone is good, valuable information that you can get, let alone benching a Pokemon with an ability like Crobat, Dedenne, etc. if you get lucky enough. And then, like I said, its attack does hit a little bit harder as well. And even up to this point too, I don't think ADP is like particularly stressed about its Eternatus matchup. I just don't think this Magearna really does enough for that matchup to warrant playing this in addition to or over something like Mawile GX. So again, another card we've looked at, it's really not bad, but there's just not a need to play this over the existing options. So yet again, I am going to pass on this metal Pokemon as well. Next up, guys, we're going to be taking a look at a new Snorlax card. Snorlax is a basic Pokemon, 130 HP, fighting weakness, and 3 retreat cost. Has this ability, once during your turn, if this Pokemon is your active, you may draw cards until you have 7 cards in your hand. If you use this ability, your turn ends. And then its only attack here for 4 colorless energy does 100 and paralysis on a coin flip. So needless to say, I think this ability is definitely the star of the show when talking about Snorlax. This is effectively just Tropical Beach in the form of an ability. Of course, Tropical Beach, it's a card we have now in the expanded format, but it's a stadium that allows you to do the same thing. You refill your hand up to 7 and end your turn. And it's a card that's seen a fair bit of play over the years, both in the standard formats it has existed in and also in expanded as well. So you would assume a Pokemon with the same effect would be kind of a slam dunk here. And while I do like this ability, I am a little bit conflicted on it. So first, let's go over the good. This is a lot of times going to work very similar to something like Intrepid Sword that we've seen in decks, as this is a very solid ability in the early turns of the game to be able to refill your hand and help you set up turn after turn until your deck is kind of firing off on all cylinders. But even outside of just trying to get set up, we've seen Tropical Beach in the past also function in decks that don't actually attempt to do damage. So think of the Chandelure Vileplume deck, or some of the various different lock decks we've seen over the year, like Shock Lock, for example. So those are the two main ways I think we're really looking at using Snorlax here. And I think Snorlax is pretty cool in that regard because it is a one prizer, unlike something like Zacian. And much like with Jirachi, we can abuse Scoop Up Net with this thing, even though it does have a big retreat cost, or just normal switch is also fine too. But my reservation for Snorlax comes from the area where I just don't know if there's a deck that's going to prefer this over something like Stellar Wish or Intrepid Sword for that matter either. And the reason I say that is because Snorlax has to be your active. Had this been an ability that you could just use from the bench, I actually see this card is great because this could easily replace Zacian in those non-metal decks that just want to use Intrepid Sword to get set up just because Snorlax would only give it one prize. It's got more flexibility in terms of how you move it from the active and oftentimes can draw you more than Intrepid Sword as well. But being in the active is definitely, I think, a big hindrance to this card. I mean, if we're going to be spending the time and effort to get a Pokemon like this into the active, I almost feel like we might just still fall back on Jirachi because we can actually use any cards we draw with Jirachis on the same turn that we get them. And it's a card that still is good in the middle and late game, whereas Snorlax is mainly going to be good in the early game. So for the moment, I'm honestly just not sure of a good home for Snorlax. I did attempt to comb through the card pool a good bit, just trying to find different deck ideas for this thing. But by and large, I think it was hard to come across something that felt extremely compelling. But that being said, even though this conversation has drifted a little bit more into negative territory, this is a great ability. Don't get this confused, guys. Snorlax just needs a deck that doesn't really particularly care to use Jirachi, or it needs a viable archetype that isn't reliant on attacking every turn, much like in the same way, like I mentioned earlier, in the case of Chandelure Vileplume or other control decks. So for that reason, I'm going to remain in the middle on this one. This ability is too good to call it bad. It's just for the moment, I'm unsure of where this card is going to fit in. Next up, we're going to be talking about a new Lugia. Lugia is a basic Pokemon with 130 HP, lightning weakness, fighting resistance, and a 2 retreat cost. It has 2 different attacks, the first of which for 2 colorless energy just does 40, but its second attack for 4 colorless energy does 250, and if your opponent has 5 or less cards in their hand, this attack does nothing. So at a glance, 250 for 4 on a 1 prizer, that's actually something that definitely catches my attention here, as that can knock out so much stuff. Of course, any 1 prizer, basically any 2 prizer, even things like Pikarom still. So this seems definitely pretty strong in that regard. But of course, guys, our opponent does have to have at least 6 cards in their hand because this specifies 5 or less. I'm not gonna lie, that's a little bit restrictive, I think, for Lugia's viability here. Even though this has a 4 energy attack cost, and at a glance that might seem like the bigger issue here, I really don't think so, as we can power this thing up with Welder and Twin Energies, but it's just going to be very difficult to actually consistently ensure that your opponent has 6 or more cards in their hand. So for that reason, I don't think we're ever probably going to build around Lugia, even though we do have a few things like Alchemy coming out in this same set, and Surprise Box to attempt to manipulate our opponent's hand size. This is just not a consistent effect, since your opponent can actually control whether you can attack or not. And an issue, I think, with a lot of the drawing cards that we have right now in the game are that they're really not adding to your hand size. Most of the popular ones right now in the game involve dumping your hand and refilling it to a certain size. So think of Marnie or Professor's Research. In the case of Research, they would have to research and like barely play any cards for you to get a consistent effect out of this attack. So I just think this is going to be overall a little bit too clunky to build around. Next up, guys, we're going to be looking at the last of the amazing rares in the set, and that's going to be Rayquaza. So Rayquaza is going to be 120 HP basic, lightning weakness, fighting resistance, and a 2 retreat cost. And its only attack here for a grass, lightning, and fighting energy says you discard all basic energy from this Pokemon, and this attack does 80 damage for each type of basic energy you discarded in this way. Man, talk about a card that is like so close to being decent, but so far at the same time. So what I mean by that is there could have definitely been a couple of slight design tweaks to this card that actually could have made it somewhat viable, but there's so much working against this. Of course, the first of which is going to be the energy cost, but that does to a degree play into the effect of the attack. You have to discard different basic energies to get that 80 multiplier for each one you discard. So that at least does synergize with this attack cost, and having lightning in the attack cost does kind of help it out a little bit since we can abuse Cocoa Prism. But realistically, if we're looking at this guy, it's going to be a struggle just to successfully get 3 energy on Rayquaza without it getting boss's orders off the bench and getting knocked out first. Let alone getting 4 or 5 different basic energies to scale up to one-shot some of the V-maxes that are in the format. I think it had this attack allowed you to discard basic energy from any Pokemon on your board, much like in the way that we've seen in the past with cards like Blacephalon GX, Magnezone Prime, etc. That would have made me a little bit happier. That way we could keep our energy spread around a little bit and have more flexibility where we want to put it. And or had this attack not required a different basic energy each time you want that 80 damage buff. Think had those two things been slightly tweaked, Rayquaza might have had a shot to see play, because we do have some ways to accelerate energy. Like I do mention, we do have Cocoa Prism, of course, but we also do have the new Jirachi and the new Trumbeak that we're going to be getting to shortly as well. Plus other things like Turbo Patch. Rayquaza does have some forms of energy acceleration, but there's just so much going against this. Just the natural clunkiness of the amazing rare sort of card design in conjunction with some of the annoying design decisions they made in this card text. I think it's just going to be probably a little bit too much for Rayquaza to really be an attacker you can count on. So for that reason, guys, I am going to have to downvote this. If we do have a more consistent way of getting these energies into play, this rating could definitely change over time. But for now, I'm just not convinced that Rayquaza, as powerful as it is, has a consistent energy acceleration engine to get it up and running every game. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at Togekiss V-max, our last V-max of the set review. 310 HP V-max, so a little bit on the lower side of HP, but it does have free retreat, which is nice. Also does have lightning weakness and a fighting resistance. And it just has one attack here for 2 colorless, does 120, and you may search your deck for up to 2 cards and put them into your hand. So this is definitely a cool change of pace from what we've seen from a lot of the V-maxes. This attack really reminds me a lot of what we saw on Magical Ribbon on Sylveon GX, all the way back from Guardians Rising, which is a card that did see a ton of play just because it had a very similar attack, where, though it didn't do damage, did allow you to grab 3 cards and just put them into your hand, and saw a lot of success as a sort of control archetype. Now, unfortunately, you can't evolve into Togekiss VMAX turn 1 like you could with Sylveon, and you do only get 2 cards, and this attack does require 2 energy. But on the plus side, we're actually doing damage, so you can actually actively put on pressure to your opponent while also searching your deck for potentially some sort of disruptive cards to annoy your opponent in the process. Because I really don't think Togekiss VMAX is going to be super successful as some sort of aggro deck, just because, let's be real, we're only hitting for 120 with a VMAX that gives up 3 prizes. That feels pretty bad. And instead of trying to increase our own aggression, we need to sort of play defense and bring the entire game down to our pace. Now, this potential archetype doesn't have some of the tools that Sylveon did, but we do still have a number of different disruptive cards in the format. Crushing Hammer is going to be one of the big ones, of course. We also have Jesse and James, which is definitely among one of my more top considerations in terms of disruptive options for this deck, along with Weezing to go with it. So we can power this thing up with triple acceleration energy. We can power it up with Welder. And just in general, I think there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how we want to build this. But I think my knee-jerk reaction would be to go down either a Welder path with this archetype, or maybe something that involves Cocoa Prism and some of the better colorless energies that exist, like powerful colorless energy, draw energy, etc. So of course, being able to search your deck for any 2 cards is massive. I really don't need to spend too much time on why that's so good. But my reservations for this card, of course, come in the form of, first, its damage output. I definitely think that is going to be a valid concern, though we can 2-shot Zacian, so that's something I do have to kind of give Togekiss a little bit of a pass on. And I'm overall just not sure if searching for 2 is enough to really set up these crazy combos, much like in the way that we saw before with Sylveon, being able to search for 3 cards. And even sometimes, I remember playing Sylveon, you're like, man, I really wish I could get a 4th card here to do this huge wombo combo. So Togekiss is going to be at kind of a slight disadvantage in terms of that. But I do like this card. I'll definitely be experimenting with it, but again, I'm just not like over the moon about it just yet. So I'm going to stay neutral on it, but probably leaning a little bit more towards the positive side. Next up, guys, we're going to conclude our Pokemon discussion with Trumbeak here. So Trumbeak is a stage 1. That's right, we are just looking at Trumbeak and not Toucannon. And we're looking at, for this ability, it has once during your turn, whenever you play this card from your hand to evolve a Pokemon, you may look at the top 3 cards of your deck, choose any number of basic energy you find there, and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like. Then shuffle the remaining cards into your deck. So I don't know what it is with Pokemon, but they seem to really love Trumbeak and continuously sort of give Toucannon the finger in terms of like decent cards or semi-playable cards. Since of course we had the Lost March Trumbeak before this thing as well. But yeah, this ability is definitely something I think we have to consider. This is basically a Max Elixir that's like half as good. Max Elixir, of course, is an item back from Breakpoint where you look at the top 6 cards of your deck and get an energy. Saw a ton of play during its lifespan in Standard and also in Expanded as well. But of course, Trumbeak is a stage 1 compared to an item you can just immediately play down, and you only get to look at the top 3 cards instead of the top 6, making the chances of hitting more than one energy kind of unlikely, I do have to say. So this is definitely the card that I think they are attempting to push for the amazing rare sort of engine to get those up and running. However, I'm not too convinced of Trumbeak in that regard. I think maybe just going all in on Jirachi might be a better way at setting up your amazing rares for the rest of the game. But one thing I do like about Trumbeak is, of course, that this ability is good kind of throughout the entire game, not just the beginning, like in the case of Jirachi. And since this is a coming into play ability, we can abuse Scoop Up Net with this as well. I really do wish this was just a static ability on the card that we could reuse every turn, but at least we do have Scoop Up Net to keep reusing these multiple times throughout the course of a game. And we do have a Oranguru as well. Oranguru is going to be a cool card because we can put an energy from our hand back on top of our deck, then use this ability to get an energy on whatever Pokemon we are looking to power up. My issue there is that I feel like your bench space is going to be super tight because you're going to have an Oranguru in play and probably 2 Trumbeaks / Pikipeks on your bench. So probably half of your field is going to be dedicated just to this sort of engine alone. And God forbid you want to play something like Jirachi or the Dene GX or some other sort of support Pokemon to help your deck get set up as well. I just don't think you're going to have the space for all of that, which is definitely, I think, a hit to any deck that might be looking to play this card. So that makes me a little bit reserved about this as well. But one of the cooler uses I could maybe see is actually Bolton V. Bolton did lose Electropower in the rotation, also lost Zeraora GX. So if there's ever any hope of like a turbo Bolton deck, I do think Trumbeak is one way we could potentially abuse this with Bolton. I think you're probably going to have some extra bench space anyways, just because Bolton really doesn't need too much to get up and running. So that's one of like the cuter ideas I've been kind of kicking around in the back of my mind with this thing. So I'm going to remain a little bit neutral on Trumbeak. Amazing rares need all the help they can get, so I'm down to take anything Pokemon wants to print that can help those. But there's definitely some challenges with this card's design that might end up holding it back from really seeing breakout success. So it's a cool card. I'm going to remain neutral on it, but it definitely has some things to keep in mind going forward for it. Next up, we're going to be looking at a new supporter card called Alistair. It says draw 3 cards, then discard up to 3 cards from your hand, but you must discard at least 1. So this card kind of reminds me of TV Reporter in a way, since TV Reporter was draw 3, then discard 1, and while this one's discard up to 3. So kind of interesting there, but I will say TV Reporter really didn't see too much play in its most recent printing. Definitely was a card that was a little bit more viable way back in like the mid-2000s era of the game when it was originally printed. But these days, cards that have you drawing 3 just really aren't too impactful, especially when we have things like Marnie and Professor's Research still in the format. So I mean, if we're playing Alistair, I think we have to be playing a deck that wants stuff in the discard. So think of something like Mad Party just as an example. That's probably one of the easier to illustrate examples. But my issue with that is that we still have Professor's Research and Roxy, which I think are just generally going to be better cards. The one nice thing about Alistair is that it can expand your hand size, whereas something like Research is just going to have you dump your hand and draw cards. But realistically, if I'm playing a card like this, I really need this thing to be like draw 4 or draw 5, something like that. I just think draw 3 is not impactful enough in today's state of the game. I think another card that I might even play over Alistair would be something like Hapu, because while Hapu does have kind of a harsher discard and is less flexible in that regard, you do get to dig 2 cards deeper. So of all the different like discarding supporters that we've had, Alistair is definitely among one of my lesser favorites. So as you can see by my rating, I'm really not a big fan of this card. So gonna pass on this one. Next up is Bia, or Bay? I honestly have no idea how you pronounce this character's name, but it's a supporter card. It says discard the top 5 cards of your deck. Attach all energy cards discarded in this way to your benched fighting Pokemon in any way that you like. So this is kind of cool because fighting Pokemon are consistently one of those types that usually have very poor energy acceleration. Like the best thing we have up until now is going to be Coalossal, and Coalossal only accelerates 1 fighting energy, and it's a stage 2, so Yeah, our options up until now have been pretty limited, I do have to say. So I definitely welcome any sort of help that fighting Pokemon could get. But as you can see by my rating, I'm not quite convinced that this card will be quite enough to really be competitive. This reminds me a lot of End's Resolve. End's Resolve, of course, was a very similar card just for dragon types and allowed you to see more cards than just 5. And End's Resolve really only saw play maybe like in the first batch of regionals. I remember when Cosmic Eclipse was legal and a lot of the early ADP lists, but it was very quickly dropped in subsequent lists once the list started getting more refined, and really hasn't seen any play since. And that was a supporter that was paired with one of the most dominant and format-defining cards that we have. While this one doesn't really have any similar fighting Pokemon that are that strong. You know, we have the new Coalossal VMAX coming out, which is definitely fine, but that's a card that already accelerates energy to itself and attacks usually for a low amount of energy. I guess maybe there's a world where you could play something like this with Phalanx. That doesn't sound horrible because it does not specify basic energy, so that means you can even accelerate those twin energies, stone fighting energies, whatever it might be that you want to. That seems kind of cute, but if the extent of this card's playability is Phalanx, that should tell you about the quality of the card that we have at our disposal here. So while I don't think this effect is like inherently horrible by any means, there's just no fighting Pokemon that I can see that are strong enough that can really effectively make good use of this. So for that reason, I am going to pass on this card. There is like a slight chance this card could see some play just because energy acceleration is always one of the best effects that we have in the game. So just by default, there's some inherent value to this card. But in the short term, I just don't really see any great options. Next up, we have another terrible supporter card. That's going to be Beauty. So it says you may play this card even if you're the player going first and then draw 2 cards. So I don't know what it is, but so far, man, this set has been striking out with supporter cards. All the ones we've been looking at up to this point. This card is so bad. I don't like it at all, but I will say I do like that we're starting to get some cards that are allowing you to bypass first turn rules. So I really like that, and I really hope this is an indicator of where card design might be going in the future. And what I mean by that is I really hope we get maybe some supporter cards like this that are in the same vein of something like Pokemon Collector, Bridget, Professor Elm's Lecture that help those one prize sort of setup decks. I would love a card like that. But if we're getting this effect and just drawing 2, yeah, this is straight binder fodder. So yeah, Beauty, cool concept for a card, but definitely really underpowered for where it needs to be. Next up, we have another supporter that's going to be Careless. I don't know. I'm really messing up a lot of these supporter names in this set review, so bear with me, guys. But this is a supporter, and it says search your deck for up to 2 rare fossils and put them on your bench, then shuffle your deck. So this is definitely a type of effect I more than welcome into the game, as the fossil Pokemon usually are some of the more convoluted Pokemon to sort of consistently get into play. We have seen Pokemon Research Lab do a decent job in a couple of different decks since its printing. I will say I do like Research Lab a good bit better because it's a stadium card, meaning that you can still play a supporter for turn potentially, and also use it on your first turn. Whereas this card is limited to you going second or on your second turn, and it takes up your supporter for turn as well. I think probably the best option we have right now is going to be Arctozolt, and Arctozolt is a sort of card you do want to swarm a lot of, just because the more you have, the more damage counters they're going to take when they attach energy. So this is definitely a card that helps that sort of deck in particular, if that ever sort of does become a thing. So I will say in the short term, I really don't like this card. I think immediately when this card releases, it's not going to be very good, but I'm still going to commit to giving it a neutral rating just because this is a card that does boost the fossil mechanic that we have. And as we get more and more fossil cards, a card like this does sort of grow in value. So I think there is some long-term potential for this, even if right away it's not going to be too impactful. Next up, we have Drone Rotom. It says, look at your opponent's hand, then look at the top card of your opponent's deck, and return it to the top of their deck. So this is like a marginally better version of Hand Scope that came out back in, I believe it was Phantom Forces, if I'm not mistaken. Card was absolute S-tier trash, flaming hot garbage. Just had you look at your opponent's hand. Card never saw play. And you can see Pokemon's like, well, maybe we'll let them look at the top card of their opponent's deck. Maybe that will make that effect a little bit better. Unfortunately, it's not the case. This card is still god-awful no matter what. I really don't think gaining the ability to see your opponent's top deck really adds much to this type of card. So, Drone Rotom, I'm going to keep this one short and sweet. This card is not good. Straight binder fodder. Sell it in your bulk. It's probably never going to be good. Next up, we have a stadium card, and that's going to be Hero's Bath. And it says, each basic Pokemon takes 20 less damage from their opponent's attacks. So I don't know if you guys saw my first impressions of the set that this card released in, but I remember whenever I saw this card, I got like uber triggered when I read this thing. Just because this card sort of epitomizes a lot of my problems I've had with the game ever since Team Up, really. And going back even further than that, back during like the mid and late black and white format, and even a good portion of the XY era as well, where basic Pokemon just keep getting all of this unnecessary support. Evolutions already have it super rough right now. It's like almost impossible for an evolution deck to be good because of the strength of all of the different basic attackers that are running around, whether it's tag teams, Pokemon V, etc. And the Pokemon that need the most help right now are going to be like the setup based decks, the stage 2 decks, all of that good stuff. And here's Bath. This is another one of these cards that just keeps compounding kind of the problem that this game has right now is how good that basic Pokemon are. And don't let my whining about this card confuse you. This card is very good. I'm just really not happy about the direction it keeps kind of pushing the game further into. So this is definitely a solid effect, making basic Pokemon take less damage. I mean, this definitely seems like kind of like an easy slot into your Zacian, Lucario, Melmetal decks. Really any sort of tanking based deck out there. I think up until now, that deck largely has just kind of played things like Chaotic Swell, just because there's really not any other stadium that particularly synergizes with it. And I think that deck is just obviously going to play this going forward because now you can play a 30 reduction from Lucario Melmetal, 20 reduction from this, 30 from something like Metal Goggles. I think also the Phalanx deck does have some potential with this as well, since that deck is also getting Stone Fighting Energy from this same set. So maybe that's a deck we will have to revisit once we start testing with cards from this new set. But I will say this, the one thing this card has going against it is the fact that this is a more passive style of effect. And what I mean by that is this is a card you can play down and potentially not get any effect of it if your opponent just bumps the stadium on their next turn. We've seen other cards kind of like this in the past. One of the most recent ones being, I believe it was Aether Paradise Conservation Area, all the way back from, I believe it was Guardians Rising, if I'm not mistaken. It was a card that saw some degree of play, not a whole lot, but very little, primarily because it was a passive stadium that your opponent could Field Blower out of play. Now, of course, we don't have Field Blower in this format, making stadiums like this a little bit safer, but nevertheless, it is still prone to your opponent just playing a counter stadium and preventing you from actually getting this effect. So that's something you will have to keep in mind. But unfortunately, I do think this is still a good card. Again, I'm not particularly happy that Pokemon keeps printing cards in this sort of direction, but I still think the card as it is solid nevertheless. So definitely one of the better trainer cards we've looked at so far in the set review. Next up, guys, we have Hero's Medal. This is a Pokemon tool card. It says the maximum HP of the Pokemon V-max this card is attached to is reduced by 100. If this Pokemon V-max is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, they take one less prize card, and you can't attach this card to a Pokemon if it would be knocked out upon attaching it. So if you're thinking this effect sounds very familiar, it should, because this is basically the same thing as Island Challenge Amulet, but for VMAX Pokemon. But outside of a broken combo in the expanded format that involved using Island Challenge Amulet to knock out your Jirachis at the beginning of the game, that card has really not seen any play for the intended use of it. And I really don't think that's going to change for Hero's Medal either. I actually think Hero's Medal is a little bit worse because with Island Challenge Amulet, you can in theory force your opponent to take 6 knockouts. With Hero's Medal, depending on the deck, of course, your opponent can still probably win by just getting 3 knockouts. I just don't think the difference between going from 3 prizes to 2 is as big as going from 2 to 1. And also one of the things that makes VMAXs good is the fact that they can tank a hit. You're like almost guaranteed to get 2 attacks off with your VMAXs before they go down. And personally, I think I would prefer just getting off 2 attacks rather than getting off 1 and giving up 1 less prize. With Island Challenge Amulet, you're giving up 50% fewer prizes. But with this, you're only giving up basically 30% fewer. So I just think Hero's Medal overall is a worse card than Island Challenge Amulet, which is already a card that hasn't been too good up until this point. I think even if this applied to Vs and VMAXs, this still probably wouldn't get a thumbs up from me. So overall, going to be a pass. Next up, we're going to be looking at a combination of trainer cards here, and that's going to be League Staff and Wyndham Stadium. So League Staff is a supporter card, says draw 2 cards, and if Wyndham Stadium is in play, draw 2 more cards. Okay, so let's check out what Wyndham Stadium does. Whenever a player plays a Pokemon VMAX from their hand during their turn to evolve a Pokemon V, heal 100 damage from that Pokemon. So both these effects, somewhat interesting. League Staff kind of reminds me a little bit of Coach Trainer, which actually has seen some play. So the precedent for like a draw 4 style supporter like this is definitely there. Coach Trainer was a card that rewarded you for playing cards that you already wanted to play. League Staff is rewarding you for playing cards that you probably don't want to play. While healing 100 damage is a cool effect, Usually if you're playing a VMAX deck, you aren't attacking with your base form Pokemon V. Usually you want to keep them safe on the bench, hiding behind something like Jirachi or some other sort of sacrificial Pokemon until you get set up, and then you evolve and start attacking. Now, of course, there are situations where your opponent might boss's orders up your unevolved VMAX, swing into it, then you can evolve. But I think usually those situations are somewhat situational and few and far between. And actually carving out deck space for this sort of effect that you're rarely going to be able to use just doesn't seem very appealing to me. I think had this stadium been a little bit better, League staff would have had a better shot at seeing play. But since this stadium is kind of lackluster, I don't think League staff is going to be a very good card by extension. Next up, we have a new supporter, and that is going to be Leon. It says, during this turn, your Pokemon's attacks do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. So this is a card we did discuss when talking about the new Charizard, and of course this is definitely going to be an auto 4 included in any sort of Charizard deck you want to build. But is this a card that we'll see play outside of Charizard? And actually I think this is a card that does have a chance at success. So looking at two cards of the past that are very similar, we have Professor Kukui and also Giovanni's Scheme. Both cards have actually seen play in their respective formats. Giovanni's Scheme was choosing between doing 20 damage or drawing until you had 5 cards. Kukui had you do 20 and draw 2 cards. So they're a little bit different than Leon just because you don't have any drawing effects, but you are doing more damage. But largely speaking, I think this fills sort of the same role that this would in any of the decks that would have played those cards either. And since we have Eldegoss V in the format, I actually do like Leon just because had we not had Eldegoss or something kind of akin to Tapu Lele GX, a card like this would honestly just be kind of too hard to find on the turn that you want to use it. But since we do have cards like Jirachi to cycle through our different trainer cards to hit what we want, and Eldegoss V, as I already kind of reiterated a few times, to get this out of the discard pile if you do have to research it away early on, means that Leon is a card that we can find a lot of the time when we do want it. 30 damage is very important in a number of different situations. Think of something like the ADP mirror match. If your opponent has something like a Metal Goggles or a Big Charm on their own Zacian, you will need a way to get over that damage reduction that they have, and Leon is a way we can do that. This can also bump us up to 290 to hit things like tag teams for a one-shot. This gives a deck like Eternatus some insane reach now. You can now hit 300, excluding any other damage modifiers like Galarian Zigzagoons. So yeah, I'm actually a decent fan of Leon. This is a card outside of Charizard that will probably pop up as a 1 of, maybe a 2 of in select decks out there. Next up, we're going to be looking at a Pokemon tool card called Memory Capsule. This one says, the Pokemon this card is attached to can use any attack from its previous evolutions, but you of course still have to pay for that attack's energy cost. So this is an effect that's very similar to other cards we've had in the past, most notably things like Shining Celebi, Shrine of Memories, and Celebi EX. All of those cards actually did see play in different capacities, so there's definitely a precedent for this effect to be good in the game. And while of course we are getting the new Eeveelutions, which we looked at the beginning of this set review, I don't think that's really where Memory Capsule is probably going to shine the most. You know, we have a massive card pool and there's all sorts of interactions between evolutions and their pre-evolutions. Some of the ones that come to mind for me, of course, that we already point out in this set review as well, are going to be the interactions between Donphan and Phanpy, and also the fairy type Clefables with the new Clefairy as well. So I think just generally speaking, I think some of the cards that could benefit the most from this are cards that have good attacks on their pre-evolutions, but have better typings on their evolutions, or cards that can abuse things like triple acceleration energy that can't abuse them on their basic forms. These are all some of the common ways I think Memory Capsule could be a card that really does shine. And even though I know a lot of people are probably thinking sort of in the one prize area, we do have to remember that VMAXs are technically evolutions. So going forward, we'll have to look at all the attacks on the pre-evolutions of VMAXs and see if Memory Capsule is a card that enables some cool plays. I think a few of the ones that have some potential are going to be Salamence VMAX, just because for a triple acceleration, you can spread 30 to everything, giving it debatably a better spread attack than the one that is printed directly on the VMAX itself. I think another one that has some shredded potential is also Morpeko. Morpeko is a deck that had some hype going into the early days of the Sword and Shield format, has kind of fallen off ever since we got Boss's Orders, unfortunately, but having Memory Capsule actually gives that deck a little bit more hope. While Morpeko could be pulled up with a Boss's Orders and easily knocked out, the VMAX is a good bit sturdier and can probably tank a hit. So going forward, that might be a card that might be worth revisiting as well. So those are definitely a few ideas that you guys are more than welcome to experiment with, but unfortunately I don't have a super uber broken use with this card just yet, but I am going to remain neutral on it. I do like this effect, and like I said, the precedent is there for this card to see play since other cards in the past, again, like Shining Celebi, Celebi EX, and Shrine of Memories all have seen play in their respective formats. So Memory Capsule, definitely a card I think is worth picking up a few copies of. Next up, we have Moo Cheese. This is a new item card, and it says heal 30 damage from up to 2 Pokemon that have any energy attached to them. So while it's nice that Moo Cheese does allow you to heal 30 from 2 Pokemon, I still think, largely speaking, this card's viability is going to be approximately the same as Potions. Now, in the past, Potion has come up every now and again, very, very seldomly. And Moo Cheese is probably no exception to that either. And of course, guys, you can see the pros and cons to this card. Yes, it lets you heal from additional Pokemon from Potion, but you do need an energy on both Pokemon that you heal from. So in some ways it's better, some ways it's a little bit worse. And overall, I think it's just going to kind of wind up in the same boat that Potion is in. So this isn't like a completely unplayable card by any means. But right now, since like I said, Potion is a card that's not seeing play, I don't expect Moo Cheese to be doing much better either. Next up, guys, we're going to be looking at Nessa. Nessa is a new supporter card, and it says choose up to 4 of any combination of water Pokemon and water energy from your discard pile and put them into your hand. So Nessa, in the context of water decks, is actually an upgraded version of Fisherman, which we have previously had. So this obviously can be a potential option for Frostmoth decks out there going forward. If you want to cut down on your energy retrievals a little bit, play 1 or 2 Nessa. That's an option you will have. Of course, the big difference is this is, of course, a supporter and not an item card. So definitely a bit of a drawback there. But of course, to make up for that, the effect is a bit stronger. This is definitely something I would have to at least consider. But really, Nessa, this is the card that they are pushing for the Cramorant archetype potentially, just because you do need ways at getting those Arrokudas back every turn. Will it see play outside of that context? It kind of remains to be seen, to be honest. I think a lot of the time, energy retrieval is going to kind of get the job done for you, or training court in terms of retrieving resources from your discard pile. Very rarely do you actually really want to get back water Pokemon that you've discarded. You know, every now and again, you'll have a game where you have to like research away 2 Frostmoth on turn 1, but that's, I think, a little bit more few and far between. So for that reason, I'm going to remain neutral on this card. Fisherman is a card that has seen play in the past, so the precedent for a card like this to be successful is definitely there. So I definitely don't think Nessa is bad. I'm just not sure if water decks necessarily are begging for this card. Definitely a card with a bit of promise, just kind of remains to be seen if people will commit the space for this thing. Next up, we have Opal. Opal is a supporter card. It says flip 2 coins for each head, search your deck for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So this was almost an insanely good card. Had this been, of course, just search your deck for any 2 cards, that'd be completely broken. Opal would definitely be a great card. But since this is a coin flip, there is a chance that you're just going to play this card and never get anything. Now, of course, you can also flip the argument around. Say sometimes you're going to flip 2 heads and you're going to be able to search your deck for 2 cards and it's going to feel busted and you're going to win your game, yada, yada. But on average, you're just going to be getting 1 card. And I think if that's the case, I would probably just prefer to play Red's Challenge at that point. Red's Challenge, of course, does have you discard 2 cards to play it, but at the same time, a lot of decks like that discarding effect that makes things like Crobat V be able to dig for more cards, that puts things like Mad Party Pokemon in the discard pile. And Red's Challenge Roy isn't seeing a lot of play, so by extension, I really don't think Opal is going to either. I think for this card to have been good, I think, of course, if they would have removed the coin flip effects entirely, that would have obviously made this good. But even if this was like search your deck for 1 card, then flip a coin of heads, search your deck for another one, I could get behind something like that. But just the way this card is currently designed, it's just too risky. And even if you flip heads and get 1 card, that's good. But as your supporter, you really want to see more cards than just 1. Especially when you compare this to something like a Professor's Research that allows you to dump your hand and draw 7, which sees you so many more cards than something like this. So I'm going to pass on this one. Almost a cool card, but definitely misses the mark a bit. Next up, we have another Pokemon tool card, and this is going to be Rocky Helmet. It says, if the Pokemon this card is attached to is your active Pokemon and is damaged by an opponent's attack, even if that Pokemon is knocked out, put 2 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. So Rocky Helmet's actually a card we've had for quite some time, going all the way back to Noble Victories. But basically for the entire lifespan of the card, it really never saw much play. The only card kind of like this that saw play is Bursting Balloon, and to a slightly lesser degree, some Seismitoad decks played a Rock Guard at different points as well as their A-spec of choice. But those cards were much more impactful as they put 6 damage counters. Of course, they each had their own drawbacks of their own, but yeah, Rocky Helmet really never saw any play. And in a format today, where HPs are significantly higher than they were back in 2011, I really don't see a convincing argument for this card. Now, of course, 2 damage counters is fine. Sometimes that is going to set up some math for you on certain things out there. But by and large, if you want to get some extra damage counters on Pokemon, we already have stuff like that. We have Vitality Band, we have Galarian Zigzagoon, we just got the new Leon in this same set. Rocky Helmet is just kind of awkward too because it's less proactive than those other cards, meaning that you're waiting for your opponent to attack into the Pokemon that has Rocky Helmet, whereas the other cards I just outlined, you can get those effects guaranteed. With this, your opponent could Tool Scrapper it, they could play Boss's Orders, and sometimes Rocky Helmets is just not even going to be impactful on the Pokemon that you play it down on. So overall, Rocky Helmet, it's cool to see old cards come back into the game, but this is just not one I'm really expecting to make a splash. Next up, we have another Pokemon tool card, and that is going to be Telephotoscope. It says the attacks of the Pokemon this card is attached to do 30 more damage to your opponent's benched Pokemon V and GX. So at first I was really excited about this card. At a glance, it kind of looks like Choice Band until you realize it says, wait, bench damage. So unfortunately not quite as strong as something like Choice Band, but this is a card that is still very interesting. Doing 30 more bench damage is really nothing to scoff at, whether it's Cramorant V, Pikarom, even Inteleon V-max, even Weezing of all things. Very frequently, you are just going to be just shy of a knockout, especially when talking about Cramorant and Pikarom in particular, because both those Pokemon are very good at knocking out things like the Dene GX, but they can't quite get there to knock out something like Eldegoss V or a Crobat V, since they both have 180 HP. And now Telephotoscope does give those decks away at actually hitting those numbers. Same thing for Inteleon V-max. Now you can turn those 3 shots on these bench sitters I just mentioned into 2 shots with Telephotoscope. So as long as we have Pokemon with good sniping attacks, where the 30 modifier is meaningful, I think this card is good. It's not a card that's going to see play in quite the same way that Choice Band did, as like a staple in every deck, of course. But as I just mentioned, there's a number of different attackers that would love to benefit from something like this. So overall, I like this card. I don't think it's like the best trainer card we've looked at, but I can easily see a world where some sort of spreading archetype or popular sniping attacker includes a few of these if their core strategy is based around bench damage. So thumbs up for me. I think this is a solid Pokemon tool, even if it is a bit situational. Next up, we're going to be looking at Aroma Grass Energy, the first of several different new special energies we're getting in this set, in the same vein as other things like Speed Lightning, Heat Fire, etc. And this one says, as long as this card is attached to a Pokemon, provides grass energy, of course, and if this card is attached to a grass Pokemon, it can't be affected by special conditions and remove all special conditions from that Pokemon. This is a very weird card because if you look at some of the other special energies that we've been getting, like Speed Lightning, the Horror Psychic Energy, Heat Fire, High Dark Energy, there's so many good ones, and this one's just like grossly underpowered by comparison. Special conditions just in general really aren't a factor in the game right now. And even if they were, I still don't think this comes close to the power as some of the other type exclusive special energies we've been getting in the Sword and Shield era. So I think really for this card to have been good, this would have needed to have been like heal 20 and remove any special conditions, or heal 30, remove all special conditions, something like that. But just removing special conditions, I don't think is nearly good enough. But if you're a grass deck and you're carving out space in your list for non-basic grass energy, more than likely it's just going to be weakness card energy at this point, since fire Pokemon are still very good in the game. So yeah, this is just an absolute hard pass. This might even be the worst of the type exclusive special energies we've gotten so far. Very weird how dirty they did grass Pokemon with this thing. Next up, we're going to be looking at Coating Metal Energy, the new special metal energy. And this one says, as long as this card is attached to a Pokemon, provides metal energy, and the metal Pokemon this card is attached to has no weakness. So this is definitely one of the better special energies we are getting in this set. Metal is a type generally that has a lot of good damage reduction modifiers, whether it's Metal Goggles, Lucario Metal GX, Metal Core Barrier, etc. But one of the things that metal Pokemon have to contend with is their problematic fire weakness, since fire is still a pretty good type in the Pokemon TCG. We lost Metal Frying Pan in the rotation, and a lot of Pokemon like Zacian have an all metal attack cost, making things like weakness guard energy a little bit clunky to play in those decks. So the fact that we're getting a metal energy that does the same thing as Weakness Guard is honestly really, really relevant. So if you are a Zacian Lucario Melmetal player, this is an easy include in your list, probably like a 3 of if I had to guess. Granted, things like Blacephalon that play scoop up nets already could start to play things like Giratina as a means of teching against these. But nevertheless, this is still going to give your metal decks a much better shot against those pesky fire decks out there. So I'm a big fan of this. Definitely one of the best cards we've actually looked at in this set, I would say. Next up, we're going to be looking at Stone Fighting Energy. This is going to be the special fighting energy, provides fighting energy, but when attached to a fighting Pokemon, that Pokemon takes 20 less damage from your opponent's attacks after applying weakness and resistance. So kind of interesting the design direction they went with this, because previously Strong Energy, which we still of course have and expanded, was plus 20, but this one's a more defensive special fighting, so that's kind of cool. And expanded actually gives you some options in terms of how you want to build your fighting decks, which is kind of cool. But yeah, I'm a fan of this card. There's definitely a few fighting Pokemon where this does fix some math for you. So think of something like Sandaconda V. Playing this is going to push you out of range of something like a Zacian V knocking you out, without the help of something like Altered Creation, of course. There's other things like Phalanx that we briefly mentioned when talking about Hero's Bath earlier in the set review, which is already a deck that really wants to go all in on its tanking options. This seems like a no-brainer for a deck like that. And of course, we're also getting the new Coalossal V-max, which already has a pretty beefy 330 HP. Now, the one downside to this card, of course, is the fact that Martial Arts Dojo is not going to give you a damage increase because Martial Arts Dojo is limited to just basic energy. That's something you will have to keep in mind if you are attempting to build with both of these cards in your lists. But even despite that, I'm a fan of this thing. I think this is a pretty solid special energy that we're getting in this set. And to conclude our set review, we have one more special energy. That's going to be Wash Water Energy. And it says, as long as this card is attached to a Pokemon, it provides water energy, but then prevent all effects of attacks from your opponent's Pokemon done to the water Pokemon this card is attached to. Existing effects are not removed though, and of course damage does not count as an effect. So of course when it says effects, we're talking about status conditions, discarding your energy, placing damage counters. All of these types of things are what count as effects in the game. Unfortunately though, I'm actually not convinced that there's many good effects that we are really worried about preventing, especially when thinking about some of the better water attackers that we have, thinking like Lapras V-max and Teleon V-max. There's not too many of those effects that we are really concerned with that are giving those decks sort of a hard time right now. And as long as that's the case, Wash Water Energy really isn't going to be very good. Now, of course, that's something that could definitely change. But as it stands, I think some of the only effects we're really concerned with are going to be Full Metal Wall GX and also some of the different effects on the attackers in the Mewtwo Mew decks. By and large, I'm not sure if those instances are frequent enough for this card's inclusion in Frostmoth decks, especially as it does hurt your basic energy consistency as well. So as it stands, guys, I think I'm going to have to pass on this thing. This is a card that maybe could see play as time goes on. A little bit better than the Special Grass Energy we just looked at, but not by a whole lot though. And with that, guys, we've made it to the end of our Vivid Voltage set review. As always, with these massive set reviews that I do on the channel, I really do appreciate you guys taking the time and making it all the way to the end here. And before we close out this video, just want to go over some of my thoughts just kind of as a whole on this new set. As always, with any new batch of cards, there are some pros and cons, and this set is no exception. For Vivid Voltage, some of the things I do like is the fact that we are getting the new amazing rares. It's always exciting when a new mechanic gets introduced into the game. Now, some of them are a little bit hit or miss, but some certainly have some potential here. We are, of course, getting more Pokemon V and V-max, and there's actually a few in this set that do sort of break the sort of formulaic design of a lot of the V-maxes up until this point. Most notably cards kind of like Coalossal V-max, Togekiss V-max, etc. And we finally got the rest of the type-exclusive special energies, which is something I've really been enjoying in this era of the game so far. But in terms of issues with this set, overall, Vivid Voltage is a pretty average set, especially when we compare this to some of the previous Sword and Shield sets. There's really not too many just absolute format defining cards like Zacian V, Eldegoss V, Crobat V, Eternatus V-max, etc. Most of the things in here are just kind of okay. I think part of this stems from the fact that our format and Japan's format, which these cards are designed for, are different. And even though I think the cards generally are average, I think the trainer cards in particular are pretty bad. There really weren't many at all that I was very positive about in the set review. There's a few okay ones, but certainly nothing comparable to something like Professor's Research, Quick Ball, Boss's Orders, Turbo Patch, etc. So overall, I'm electing to give Vivid Voltage a 3 out of 5. This is a decent set, but certainly lacks the impact of the other Sword and Shield sets that we've had up until this point. Now, of course, we did look at a ton of cards today, and I'm sure my opinions might not always match up with your own. So be sure to sound off down below in the comment section, guys. What are you looking forward to in this set? Are there any cards you think I was a little too harsh on? Some you didn't think I gave enough credit to? Definitely sound off below. I want to know what you guys in the community are thinking about all the new cards in Vivid Voltage. But if you did enjoy today's content, of course, smack that like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you can, consider supporting this channel as well by becoming a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or by picking up some merch from our online store, rarecandytcg.com. It would mean a lot. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.